Vanity Fair. One sunny morning in June, two young ladies were driven up to the gates of Miss Pinkerton's Academy for Young Ladies on Chiswick Mall in London. "It's Mrs. Sedley's coach, sister," said Miss Jemima, assistant to Miss Pinkerton. "Have you completed all the necessary preparations for the girls' departure?" asked Miss Pinkerton herself. "Indeed, the girls were up at 4 this morning, packing their trunks, sister." "And I trust, Miss Jemima, that you have made a copy of Miss Sedley's account. This is it? Very good. £93 4 Be kind enough to address it to John Sedley, Esquire, and to enclose this letter I have written to his lady." The note stated that after 6 years of residence at the Academy, Miss Amelia was being returned to her parents as a young lady able to occupy a fitting position in their polished and refined circle. Those virtues which characterize the young English gentlewoman, those accomplishments which become her birth and station, will not be found wanting in the amiable Miss Sedley, whose industry and obedience have endeared her to her instructors, and whose delightful sweetness of temper has charmed both her aged and youthful companions. The letter completed, Miss Pinkerton proceeded to write her own name and Miss Sedley's on the fly-leaf of a presentation copy of Johnson's dictionary, which went to all her scholars on their departure. Miss Jemima handed Miss Pinkerton a further copy. "For whom is this?" she asked. "Becky Sharp," answered Jemima. "She's leaving us too." "Miss Jemima!" exclaimed Miss Pinkerton. While Miss Sedley's papa was a merchant in London and a man of some wealth, Miss Sharp was merely an articled pupil for whom Miss Pinkerton had done, as she thought, quite enough already. Before long the carriage rolled away and the great gates were closed behind it. The world was before the two young ladies. Miss Rebecca Sharp had 2 reasons for thanking heaven. Firstly, for ridding herself of someone she hated, and secondly, for enabling her to extract some sort of victory over her enemies. By nature, Miss Rebecca was not in the least bit kind. Her father was an artist, while her mother was an opera girl. This lady had had some education, and her daughter spoke French fluently. Becky's mother having died, her father had recommended his daughter to Miss Pinkerton's protection. Rebecca was small and slight. Her eyes were her most attractive feature. In order to maintain authority, it had become necessary for Miss Pinkerton to remove this rebel, this monster, this firebrand from her school. So when she heard that Sir Pitt Crawley's family required a governess, she recommended Miss Sharp for the situation. Miss Sedley, now 17, was friendly with Miss Sharp and invited her friend to spend a week with her at home before she took up her duties as governess. At Russell Square, the girls alighted from the carriage, and Amelia showed her friend round the house. When Rebecca saw the 2 magnificent cashmere shawls which Joseph Sedley had brought home for his young sister, she commented that it must be delightful to have a brother. She thereby so easily earned the pity of the tender-hearted Amelia for being alone in the world and an orphan without friends or kindred. "You are not alone, Rebecca," replied Amelia, "for I shall always be your friend and love you as a sister. Indeed I will." "Ah, but you have such kind, rich, affectionate parents who give you everything you ask for, including their love. My poor papa can afford nothing, and I have but 2 frocks in all the world. And then to have a brother as well. How you must love him." Amelia laughed. "Joseph doesn't care whether I love him or not. He's very kind and good, but he rarely speaks to me." "Isn't he very rich?" asked Rebecca. "They all say Indian nabobs are very rich." "I believe he has a very large income, though he is not yet married." The meaning of these questions, as translated in the heart of this ambitious young woman, was simply this. If Mr. Joseph Sedley is rich and unmarried, why should I not marry him? I know I have only a fortnight, but there's no harm in trying." She determined to make an attempt. The girls went through to see Joseph. "He's very handsome," whispered Rebecca to Amelia rather loudly when she saw him. "Do you think so? I'll tell him." "Oh, darling, not for the world." The brother and sister greeted each other. In minutes, Mr. Sedley Sr. arrived and greeted his daughter and Miss Sharp. Joseph Sedley was 12 years older than his sister, and a liver complaint had forced him back from India. He did not live with his family while in London, but had lodgings of his own which he shared with a young bachelor. He frequented theatres and the opera. Rebecca's compliments and attention to the conversation during dinner seemed to have an effect on Joseph, who left shortly afterwards. "Rebecca has frightened him away," remarked Mrs. Sedley. "Poor Joe. Why is he so shy?" Poor Joe's panic lasted for 2 or 3 days, during which time he did not visit his parents' house, nor, during that period, did Miss Rebecca mention his name. However, she was very grateful to Mrs. Sedley, and delighted beyond measure by the bazaars and theatres of London. One day Amelia had a headache and could not go out to the party to which the 2 young people had been invited. Nothing could induce her friend to go without her. "Amelia, you, who have shown a poor orphan what happiness and love are for the first time, me leave you? Never," said Becky, her green eyes looking up to heaven filled with tears. Mrs. Sedley was pleased to see that her daughter's friend was so charming and kind-hearted. In time, everyone else in the household was also charmed by Miss Sharp. One day Joe Sedley made a further appearance. As if it was her purpose to advance Rebecca's plans in every way, Amelia reminded her brother of his promise to visit Vauxhall. "The girls must have a gentleman apiece," said his father. In consequence, Mr. Sedley's godson, Lieutenant George Osborne, was recommended by the elderly merchant as a particularly suitable companion. He gave a hardly noticeable wink at Amelia as he pronounced this name. Mrs. Sedley chided her husband for his attitude towards their son. "My dear," he replied, "Joss is a great deal vainer than you ever were. I've no patience with him and his dandified modesty. Emmy's little friend is making up to him as hard as she can, and if she does not catch him, someone else will. Mark my words, the first woman who fishes for him will hook him." The evening of the proposed outing brought a thunderstorm, and so the 4 young people were forced to stay at home instead. Mr. Osborne did not seem in the least disappointed, and he and Joseph Sedley drank port, while Amelia did the honours in the dining-room. She was delighted to see her handsome, dashing George again, whom she had known and adored since childhood, while Rebecca welcomed the opportunity to continue her campaign against Joseph. When the couple were alone, Miss Sharp observed, "There seems no need to ask about family secrets in this house, since those 2 have already told theirs." "As soon as he gets his company," replied Joseph, "I believe the matter will be settled. George Osborne is a capital fellow." "And your sister the dearest creature in the world," added Rebecca. "Ah, happy the man that wins her." With this, Miss Sharp heaved a great sigh. Almost for the first time in his life, Mr. Sedley found himself talking without the least timidity or hesitation to a person of the other sex. He answered all Miss Sharp's questions about his life in India and was utterly charmed by her singing, which was indeed very accomplished. While Joss was bestowing his attentions on Miss Sharp, his father called out, "Bravo, Joss!" which instantly made Joss relapse into an alarmed silence, and soon afterwards he departed. That night he considered how delightful it would be to take Miss Sharp to the Calcutta ball, where he was sure she would be a sensation. Indeed, it occurred to him how pleasant it would be to have such a modest, attractive, and accomplished girl as a wife, even if she hadn't a penny to her name. The next day Joseph Sedley made his appearance before lunch. He had never been known before to confer such an honour on Russell Square. The weather was very fine, and the jaunt to Vauxhall was decided upon. Osborne and Amelia found the other couple in the drawing-room where Joss had spoken not a single word. "I'm sure he will tonight, dear," Amelia said as she pressed Rebecca's hand. Joss, too, had considered a proposal and promised himself, "Gad, I'll pop the question at Vauxhall." George mentioned that he had invited his great friend William Dobbin to join their party. They had been friends since school days, and Dobbin thought the world of George, to whose regiment he had been appointed. Since the first days of their friendship, his father, a grocer, had become very wealthy and even acquired a title, but William had remained as modest and as unassuming as ever. While Mr. Sedley had decided that Joss could marry whom he liked, Amelia was quite enthusiastic about a match with Rebecca. It was Mrs. Sedley's opinion that her son would demean himself by a marriage to an artist's daughter, but she also saw that the couple could be very comfortable in the longer term. So everything seemed to smile on Rebecca's fortunes as they took their carriage to Vauxhall. In due course the party arrived at the Royal Gardens. Within a few minutes the mated pairs were prattling away quite happily, and Dobbin was clean forgotten. Joss was in his glory and insisted on having a bowl of punch. The young ladies did not drink it. Osborne did not like it, and so Joss, that fat gourmand, drank the entire contents of the bowl. Although he enjoyed it hugely, he completely lost his wits, singing, quarrelling, and calling Rebecca his dearest diddle darling, which not only lost Miss Sharp the prospect of obtaining the proposal she wanted, but also made the party very conspicuous. A commotion seemed inevitable when, by great good luck, Dobbin, who had been walking about the gardens in the meantime, rejoined them. "Good heavens, Dobbin, where had you been?" Osborne asked, holding Amelia. "Make yourself useful and take charge of Joss here, while I take the ladies to the carriage." So Dobbin induced Joss to leave the gardens and, once out of the gates, easily conveyed him into a carriage which deposited him safely at his lodgings. George Osborne conducted the ladies home and then walked across Russell Square, laughing loudly. Amelia looked very ruefully at her friend as they went upstairs. Then she kissed her and went to bed without saying a word. "He must propose tomorrow," thought Rebecca, as did Amelia. The next morning the young Sedley was groaning. George Osborne found this ex-collector of Bogley Wollah on the sofa in his lodgings. Dobbin was already in the room tending his patient. George Osborne's teasing remarks to the prostrate Joss concerning his behaviour of the previous night and his boldness towards Miss Rebecca made Joss grimace terribly. In truth, Osborne did not fancy a penniless governess as a sister-in-law. When George arrived at Russell Square later that morning, Rebecca had some alarming thoughts. "Has he been laughing about me to Joseph? Has he frightened him off? Perhaps he won't be returning." A cloud passed over her eyes and her heart beat quickly. "You're always joking," she said to George. "Joke away. There's nobody to defend me." Amelia looked reprovingly at George. "My dearest Amelia," he said, once Becky had walked away, "you are too good, too kind. You don't know the ways of the world as I do. Your little friend, Miss Sharp, must learn her station. Don't you think Joss will—" "My dear, I don't know. He may or may not. I'm not his master. I only know he is a foolish, vain fellow and put my dear girl into a very awkward position last night." Joss did not arrive that day, but the following morning he sent round a note. Amelia read it. "Dear Amelia, I was too ill to visit yesterday. I am leaving town today for Cheltenham. Pray excuse me if you can to the amiable Miss Sharp for my conduct at Vauxhall, and entreat her to pardon and forget every word I may have uttered. As soon as I have recovered, for my health is very much shaken, I shall be going to Scotland for some months. Truly yours, Joe Sedley." It was all over. Amelia did not dare to look at Rebecca's pale face and burning eyes, but quickly dropped the letter into her friend's lap and rushed upstairs to her room, where she cried her heart out. It now became clear to everyone in the house, except poor Amelia, that Rebecca should leave as speedily as possible. So it was that Rebecca and Amelia went their separate ways, the former vowing to love her friend for ever and ever. Sir Pitt Crawley, Baronet, of Queen's Crawley, Hants, and Great Gaunt Street, London, was well known, but neither liked nor respected in the great world. Becky went to his house in town, from where she would accompany him to his country estate, where he spent most of his time. She had been engaged to educate the two daughters of his plebeian second wife. Becky was full of anticipation of the elegance and good manners that a baronet must surely possess. To her surprise, the door of the house was opened by an elderly, bald-headed man with leering grey eyes set in a red face. He led her into the gloomy mansion, where she learnt, to her astonishment, that he was Sir Pitt Crawley himself, in spite of his rough accent and shabby clothes. Whatever Sir Pitt Crawley's qualities might be, good or bad, he did not make the least disguise of them. He talked of himself incessantly, sometimes in the coarsest terms, and sometimes adopting the tone of a man of the world, and so, with instructions to Miss Sharp to be ready at 5 the next morning, he bade her good night. Shortly after her arrival at Queen's Crawley, Becky wrote to Amelia. My dearest and sweetest Amelia, oh, what a change between today and yesterday! Now I am friendless and alone, while yesterday I was in sweet company. Sir Pitt is not at all what we imagined a baronet must be like. Consider an old, stumpy, vulgar, and very dirty man, in old clothes and shabby gaiters, who smokes a horrid pipe. He speaks with a country accent and swears a good deal at the charwoman and the coachman. He is a stingy, avaricious person. He never gives money to anybody. A carriage and four took us to the baronet's park. There's a fine avenue to the house, an old red building with tall chimneys covered in ivy. In front of the house there is a terrace flanked by the family crest of Dove and Serpent, and onto which the great hall doors opened. And, my dear, the great hall is, I'm sure, as big and as glum as the great hall of the castle of Udolpho. Round the room hang the portraits of I don't know how many generations of Crawleys. At one end of the hall is a staircase leading to the library and the other rooms, of which there seem to be at least 20 upstairs. Becky went on to describe Sir Pitt's neglected wife, incapable of living up to her position, the two little girls, the pious and solemn step-brother, Mr. Pitt, the heir, and Rawdon, the younger son, now away with his regiment, who had a particular hold over his father, the major reason for which was financial. The baronet owed his son a sum of money out of the will of his mother, which he did not find convenient to pay, and, in fact, could only be brought by force to discharge his debts. Miss Sharp calculated that the mere payment of his creditors cost the honourable baronet several hundreds yearly, but this was a delight he could not forego. He took a savage pleasure in making the poor wretches wait. What's the good of being in Parliament, he said, if you must pay your debts? Sir Pitt's brother, Bute Crawley, reigned at the rectory. Little love was lost between the two families, and the hopes of both were concentrated on the fortune owned by Miss Crawley, Sir Pitt's half-sister. The question of how she would dispose of the money was a source of anxiety to everyone. Miss Sharp was respectful and obedient with Mr. Crawley, and the new governess found many different ways of being useful to the baronet. It seemed that Rawdon had Miss Crawley's favour, for she had even been known to settle his debts when, as became a dashing young officer in the dragoons, they became too pressing. Great was the fuss that was made of the old lady on her visits to Queen's Crawley, and the old house had better meals and experienced a general air of ease, quite absent on other occasions. Rebecca settled down in the household, and the baronet grew more and more dependent on her for advice. Soon little was done without her being consulted. Becky became almost mistress of the house when Mr. Crawley was absent. She was a different person from the shy, dissatisfied girl she had been, and this change of temper had resulted from greater prudence and moral courage. The elder and younger sons in the Crawley household were, like the lady and gentleman in the weather box, never at home together, since they hated each other cordially. Rawdon never came to the house except when his aunt paid her annual visit. The old lady had a snug little house in Park Lane, and as she ate and drank a great deal too much during the London season, she went to the cures at Harrogate and Cheltenham during the summer. She was most hospitable and jovial. It was a great day when Miss Crawley decided on a visit to her relatives, and Rebecca described the visit in detail to Amelia. "My dear, Miss Crawley has arrived with her fat horses, fat servant, and fat spaniel. She looks a very apoplectic soul, so no wonder her brothers are anxious about her. When she comes into the country, the hall becomes an open house. We have dinner parties at which we drink claret and champagne as if we were accustomed to it every day. We have candles in the schoolroom and fires to warm ourselves with. Another admirable effect of Miss Crawley and her £70,000 is to be seen in the conduct of the two brothers Crawley, I mean the baronet and the rector, who hate each other all the year round but become quite loving at Christmas. No quarrelling is heard in Miss Crawley's presence. Only Mr. Pitt, whom the old lady abominates, finds it necessary to go up to town during her visit. That is the signal for the young dandy Captain Crawley to put in an appearance. He is a very large young man, 6 feet tall, and he speaks with a great voice. He swears a great deal and orders all the servants about to adore him nonetheless, for he is very generous with his money. The captain has a hearty contempt for his father and a dreadful reputation among the ladies. Shall I tell you a compliment the captain paid me? I must, it is so pretty. One evening we actually danced together. I overheard him say, "By Jove, she's a neat little filly," meaning your humble servant. He gets on well with all the other young squires with whom he drinks, bets, rides, and talks about hunting and shooting. But he says the country girls are all bores. When the parties were over, Miss Crawley would say, "Come to my dressing-room, Becky, and let us abuse the company," which between them they did perfectly. "My dear, you are a perfect find," Miss Crawley would say. "I wish you could come to see me in London." At other times she would urge Rawdon and Becky to sit with her, declaring, "We're the only 3 Christians in the county." In a short time, Miss Crawley, who prided herself on her liberal opinions, announced that Becky was the only person in the whole countryside whose conversation had any life or wit in it. However, neither Miss Crawley or Amelia heard of all of Rebecca's encounters with Rawdon. The dragoon was slow of speech and had no talent for pretty words, but Becky could see admiration in his eyes and kept him dangling after her. Without sacrificing one whit of the delicacy and modesty that had been impressed on all Miss Pinkerton's young ladies, she used her fine eyes and pretty voice with a subtlety that the Academy could never have appreciated. But what of Amelia, the young ladies in Amelia's society? The sisters Osborne and Dobbin agreed on Amelia's trifling merits and asked each other with increasing wonder, what on earth could George find in that creature? George gave himself up to be loved with a good deal of ease, and by now he took Amelia's worship as a matter of course. Many were the pangs the poor child suffered when George was too busy to spare time for her. Gambling, playing cards or billiards, and the other questionable enjoyments of many of his brother officers took up much of his time, and little Emmy had to bear it all with uncomplaining patience, though her pillow was often wet with her tears as a result. What were her parents doing to keep their daughter's heart from beating too fast? Old Sedley did not seem to notice. He was more serious of late, and his city affairs absorbed him, while Mrs. Sedley was merely uninquisitive. Soon George was back with his regiment and away from London. His letters to Amelia were short and soldier-like, while Amelia's were written on many sheets of large paper and were full of repetitions. Unfortunately, the gentleman to whom Miss Amelia's letters were addressed was a tenacious critic. With such a volume of correspondence following Lieutenant Osborne about the country, he became almost ashamed of the jokes his mess-room companions made about them. In the end, he ordered his servant never to deliver them except to his private apartment. For some time he tried to keep the liaison a secret, but to no avail. One day Captain Dobbin urged him to see Amelia, and so the following day Osborne prepared to go to town. "I should have liked to make her a little present," Osborne said to his friend, "only I am quite out of cash until my father stumps up." Dobbin allowed his good nature and generosity to get the better of him and gave George a few pound notes. And dare say George would have bought something nice for Amelia had he not been attracted by a shirt-pin in a jeweller's window in Fleet Street. When he arrived at the Russell Square house, Amelia's face lit up. Her anxiety and tears were soon forgotten. She went over to George, who kissed her very kindly on her forehead and was very gracious and good to her. She thought his diamond shirt-pin the prettiest ornament she had ever seen. The young pair passed 2 hours in conversation, building castles in the air. Since the lieutenant had only that single day in town and a great deal of business to transact, it was proposed that Miss Emmy should dine with her future sisters-in-law. The invitation was accepted joyfully. When George returned half an hour late for dinner, he was in a very good humour. Not so old Mr. Osborne. He had returned from the city that day disturbed and uneasy. When Amelia had greeted him, he gave only a surly grunt of recognition in reply. He had looked around gloomily and asked his eldest daughter, "Why the devil is she here?" "George is in town, Papa, and will be here for dinner." "Oh, is he? Well, I won't keep the dinner waiting for him." At dinner-time, Amelia was seated next to the awful old Osborne. The soup was poured. Then, in a minute, the old man ordered, "Take Miss Sedley's plate away. She can't eat the soup any more than I can. It's ghastly. Take it away, Hicks, and turn the cook out of the house tomorrow, Jane." And so the dismal meal proceeded. George's arrival lightened the tone only briefly, for the gloom on the paternal countenance made him anxious. How would he now be able to extract the money from the governor that he so wanted? He began praising his father's wine, and gradually managed to soften the hard gaze. After dinner, old Mr. Osborne took George aside and asked him about Amelia. Did he intend to marry her? "Why, sir, did you not order me to marry her? Wasn't it settled a long time ago?" "Have a care, sir. Why shouldn't you marry higher than a stockbroker's daughter, George?" "It's a family business, sir. You and Mr. Sedley arranged the match ages ago." "I don't deny it, but people's positions alter, sir. I can tell you in confidence that I don't like the look of Sedley's affairs at present. He's been dabbling on his own account, so unless I see Amelia's 10,000 down, you won't marry her. I'll have no lame duck's daughter in my family. Now, pass the port, sir, and ring for the coffee." George hurried upstairs to Amelia in the highest of spirits. For Amelia, the memory of that happy evening lived for days afterwards. No evening seemed to have passed so quickly before. The next morning, George took a tender leave of her and then set off for the city to see his father's head clerk and obtain some money. As he went in, he caught sight of old John Sedley looking decidedly gloomy. That evening, Amelia wrote one of her long and tender letters to George. "Poor little Emmy, how fond she is of me," said George to himself, having read the missive. About this time, Miss Crawley returned to her exceedingly snug and well-appointed house in Park Lane. She arrived in a bundle and was briskly conveyed upstairs to be put to bed in a room warmed for her reception. Becky had accompanied the old lady. The good wine and elaborate dishes prepared at Queen's Crawley in Miss Crawley's honour had proved a little too much for her. Medical men were sent for. They came, prescribed, and vanished. The following day, Captain Crawley paid a visit from his barracks in Knightsbridge. He was most affectionate in his inquiries regarding his aunt. He found Miss Crawley's maid unusually sulky and despondent, and Miss Briggs, her country servant, in tears in the drawing-room. He learned there was a new nurse. Rebecca then came downstairs, greeted the relative, and took him into the parlour, where they discussed the invalid. Later that day, Miss Sharp consoled Miss Briggs by telling her that she would be leaving to return to the country as soon as Miss Crawley was better. Before long, Miss Crawley was so well that she could sit up, and laughed heartily at Rebecca's imitation of Miss Briggs and her grief. Captain Crawley came every day to receive bulletins from Miss Sharp about his aunt's health. This improved so rapidly that even poor Miss Briggs was allowed to see her patroness, while the baronet did little to disguise his extreme mortification at this turn of events. While everybody was attending to Miss Crawley, there was a lady in another part of the Crawley estate who had become seriously ill, but of whom no one took the least notice. Left to fade away in her lonely room was the Lady of Crawley herself. Becky watched by Miss Crawley's bedside with complete patience. Nothing escaped her. During the illness she was never out of temper and always alert, always smiling, fresh and neat. The captain was quite taken with her, and he confided the secret to his aunt at the rectory, of all people. She warned him and argued with him, clearly seeing his folly. She knew Rawdon must go back to his regiment and away from London. He must not be allowed to play with the poor girl's feelings. There was even a suggestion, which reached Rawdon's ears, that Sir Pitt himself might have designs on Becky. As it happened, the whole house seemed a desert without her, so useful and pleasant had Rebecca made herself. Virtually every day brought a letter from Sir Pitt, urging Becky to return or conveying pathetic statements to Miss Crawley regarding the neglected state of his daughter's education, documents to which Miss Crawley paid little attention. Once Miss Crawley was well enough to drive out, the old lady visited John Sedley, since both Amelia and Becky had been absorbed in their own affairs for a while. Their first meeting on the renewal of their friendship was brisk. Miss Crawley, however, was captivated by the sweet, blushing face of the young lady who came out to her carriage to pay her respects to her companion. "What a complexion, my dear," Miss Crawley said as they drove away. "My dear Miss Sharp, your young friend is charming. Send for her to come to Park Lane, do you hear?" Miss Crawley was to talk of Amelia with rapture half a dozen times that day. She mentioned her to Rawdon Crawley. At this, Rebecca instantly stated that Amelia was engaged to be married to a Lieutenant Osborne, a very old friend. Rawdon knew him and said, "Ma'am, of all the young men I've seen in the regiment, this fellow's the best. His father's a city man, immensely rich, they say. Indeed, I've not finished winning money from Osborne yet." "Captain Crawley, I shall warn Amelia. Imagine a gambling husband," replied his aunt. "Dreadful, isn't it?" the captain replied, then added, "I say, ma'am, let's invite him over here. He's a presentable sort of person. I'll write to him. Where does he live, Miss Sharp?" Becky told him George's address. Thus Captain Rawdon dispatched an invitation to Osborne, while Rebecca sent one to her darling Amelia. The little party proved quite a success, as George was flattered at being asked to the house of one of the nobility, though Rawdon did not much care for his condescending attitude towards Becky. Rebecca, however, stood her ground and routed George. Not that Rebecca was in the right, but she most successfully managed to put George in the wrong. As a result, George shamefully fled, feeling, if he stayed another minute, that he would have been made to look foolish in Amelia's presence. Although he was above taking revenge on a lady, he could not resist confiding to Captain Crawley that Becky was a dangerous, desperate flirt. "I only warn you," said George, "because I know women, and I advise you to be on the lookout. "Thank you, my boy," replied Crawley. "You're wide awake, I see." A short time afterwards, news came of Lady Crawley's lonely death, though none wept for that unhappy lady. Miss Crawley's only comment was, "I do hope my brother will have the decency not to marry again." "What a confounded rage Pitt will be in if he does," added Rawdon. Rebecca said nothing. She seemed by far the most serious and upset of the mourners. Sir Pitt, coming to town to deal with his various affairs, once again begged Miss Becky to return. There was something unusual in his manner that disturbed the normally self-possessed young woman. "I don't think it would be right to be alone with you, sir," Becky said when they met. "I can't get on without you," confessed Sir Pitt. "I didn't see it till you went away. The house goes all wrong. It's not the same place. You must come back. Oh, do come back, dear Becky, do come. Come as Lady Crawley, if you like. There. Will that satisfy you? Come back and be my wife. Birth be hanged. You're as good a lady as ever I seen. Will you come, yes or no?" "Oh, Sir Pitt," cried Rebecca, deeply moved. "Say yes, Becky. I'm an old man, but a good 'un. I'm good for 20 years. I'll make you happy, see if I don't." The old man fell to his knees while Rebecca looked on in consternation, weeping the most genuine tears that ever fell from her eyes. "Oh, Sir Pitt," she said, I'm married already." "Who is it then you're married to?" Becky was silent. "So the rascal ran off, eh?" Sir Pitt said. "Never mind, Becky, I'll take care of he." Miss Crawley then arrived on the scene, none too pleased. "I have thanked Sir Pitt, ma'am," said Rebecca, "but I have told him that I can never become Lady Crawley." "You refused him? It don't seem to have broken his heart, at any rate," commented Miss Crawley. The old man had recovered himself remarkably quickly, and soon departed chuckling, telling Becky that she could count on him as a friend, and he'd be glad to see her back at Queen's Crawley. Briggs and Miss Crawley wondered to their hearts' content at Sir Pitt's offer and Rebecca's refusal. It was a glittering prize that Rebecca had missed, but she was ever one to take life as she found it, and she confessed, to the astonishment of Miss Crawley, that, deeply as she was touched by the honour, another attachment bound her. She did not say to whom, for she realized that, in spite of the old woman's protestations as to her liberal mind, when she learned of the marriage of the penniless little governess to none other than her favourite nephew, Rawdon Crawley himself, she would be far from pleased. Yet their marriage could be kept a secret no longer, so when Becky told Rawdon that a great crisis was near and the time for action had arrived, he expressed himself ready to act under her orders. She told him of her decisions, and he agreed to everything. "You're sure to get us out of this scrape, Becky," he declared, "for I never saw your equal." And with this simple confession of faith, the love-stricken dragoon left her to execute his part of the project. Early on the morning of the second day after Sir Pitt Crawley's offer had been refused, a maid took a letter to Miss Briggs, announcing, "Oh, miss, something must have happened. There's nobody in Miss Sharp's room. The bed ain't been slept in, and she've run away and left this letter for you." "Dear Miss Briggs," the letter went, "the kindest heart in the world, as is yours, will pity me and sympathize with me, and excuse me. I have gone where my duty commands, to my husband. Yes, I am married. My husband commands me to live in the humble home which we will call our own. Dearest Miss Briggs, break the news to my dear, beloved friend and benefactress. Oh, with what joy will I return to Deer Park Lane! I am wedded to the best and most generous of men, for Miss Crawley's Rawdon is now my Rawdon. I can say no more. Blessings to all, your affectionate and grateful Rebecca Crawley." The old lady's anger at the news was only exceeded by the fury of Sir Pitt when he arrived to fetch the girl back to Hampshire. In a tempest of wrath he cursed both her name and Rawdon's. While Becky was endeavouring to advance her fortunes, the Sedley family had suffered a bitter blow. Affairs in Europe had affected the business, and old Sedley was utterly ruined. The house in Russell Square and its contents were put up for sale. At the auction there was a tussle for a little piano beloved by Amelia, until at last the hammer fell and it came into the possession of Captain Dobbin. Its destination was a tiny villa in Fulham, which was now the home of the broken man, and where his wife and Emmy managed on an allowance sent to them by Joseph. Through Becky's attentions, that veteran rake, Rawdon Crawley, found himself converted into a very happy and submissive married man. His wife was ever smiling and cheerful. His comfortable little lodgings, his homely meals and snug evenings had all the charms of novelty and secrecy. Becky was quite content to wait until the reconciliation with the old aunt took place before claiming her rightful position in society, while Rawdon lived comfortably in debt, for everything was plentiful in his house, except ready money. Of all Sedley's creditors, the most determined and obstinate seemed to be John Osborne, his old friend and neighbour, whose son was to marry Sedley's daughter. Whenever old John Sedley reflected on the affair between George and Amelia, it was with a bitterness almost as great as that Mr. Osborne himself had shown. He cursed Osborne and his family as heartless, wicked, and ungrateful. No power on earth, he swore, would induce him to marry his daughter to the son of such a villain, and he ordered Emmy to banish George from her mind, and to return all the presents and letters she had ever had from him. Although she promised to obey, Amelia hesitated over the letters. She brooded over the worthless papers. When a letter came from old Osborne declaring her marriage to George to be now quite out of the question, she took the statement with a deadly calm. As a result of Napoleon's arrival in Paris from exile, all France took up arms to defend him, while the rest of Europe was determined to oust him. While the French nation and army were swearing fidelity round the eagles on the Champ de Mars, 4 mighty European armies were mobilizing. One of these was British and included Captains Dobbin and Osborne. Some days later, in the barracks, Dobbin found Osborne in his room, his head resting on the table in a state of despondency. "She sent me back the things I gave her, some damned trinkets. Look here." He gestured to a little packet addressed in a well-known hand and at the various items lying about. "It's all over," he groaned. "Look, Will, you may read the letter if you like." Amelia's short note released George from their engagement and wished him farewell. Dobbin was very soft-hearted. The idea of Amelia, broken-hearted and lonely, tore his good-natured soul with anguish. He swore that Amelia was an angel, with which George agreed. He blushed with remorse and shame at the remembrance of how his own selfish indifference contrasted with her perfect purity. For a while, glory, war, everything was forgotten, and the two friends talked only about Amelia. Dobbin could scarcely conceal his feelings, for to him Amelia was the ideal of all that womanhood could mean, even though he might not share in it. Some hours after the conversation between Dobbin and Osborne, an Irish serving-maid entered Amelia's room and handed her a letter. Emmy took it and read, "I must see you now. Dearest Emmy, dearest love, dearest wife, come to me." George and her mother were outside, waiting until she had read the letter. George's return was to bring unimaginable joy to her simple, loving heart that had known only bitterness and despair in recent months. It did not take long for the roses to return to Amelia's pale cheeks and the brilliance to her pretty eyes. While Rawdon was prosperous, he was obeyed only with sulky acquiescence, and when his ruin came, there was nobody to help or pity him. When Mrs. Bute Crawley took command at Park Lane, the garrison were charmed to act under such a leader. Mrs. Bute knew Rebecca to be too clever, spirited, and desperate a woman to submit without a struggle, and felt that she must prepare herself for combat and always be on her guard. After the shock of the news of Becky's marriage, Miss Crawley took to her bed for several days. On her recovery, Mrs. Bute Crawley endeavoured to instil in everyone a proper abhorrence for all of Rawdon Crawley's manifold sins. Having the old lady near at hand, she made more than one attempt to induce her to change her will, but Miss Crawley's usual terrors regarding death greatly increased when such dismal propositions were made. Mrs. Bute saw that she must get her patient in cheerful spirits before she could hope to obtain the object she had in view. With this in mind, she took Miss Crawley on excursions around Highgate and Hampstead. The old lady, however, quickly tired of these places and demanded to be taken to the park. Mrs. Bute acquiesced, but with some reluctance, since she knew they might meet the abominable Rawdon there, and she was right. One day Rawdon's carriage came into sight with Rebecca sitting beside him. As the two carriages passed by each other, Rawdon trembled, while Miss Crawley looked resolutely towards the Serpentine. When the two vehicles came in line again, Rawdon stood up and looked straight across. This time Miss Crawley and Mrs. Bute looked him full in the face and cut their nephew pitilessly. He sank back in his seat with an oath and, striking out, dashed homewards. It was a gallant and decided triumph for Mrs. Bute, but she felt regular meetings of that kind should be avoided, so she suggested to Miss Crawley that they go to Brighton. It now seemed to Rawdon that to be ordered abroad might be the best solution to his present difficulties. Without knowing how, Captain William Dobbin found himself the great promoter, arranger, and manager of the match between George Osborne and Amelia. However, Mrs. Sedley was of the opinion that her husband would now never consent to the marriage. "They must run away together, ma'am," said Dobbin. Mrs. Sedley was all excitement about the possibility. Dobbin emphasized to George the necessity for immediate action. He wished George to go through with the wedding before the regiment departed for foreign service. When Dobbin went to obtain the views of the fallen John Sedley, the old man insisted that the marriage between Amelia and George should never take place. "Then we must make do without your consent," Dobbin replied, smiling, and told him of Rebecca's elopement with Captain Crawley. It evidently amused the old gentleman. "You're terrible fellows, you captains," he said, smiling, for the idea of hitting his enemy Osborne such a blow soothed the old gentleman. He and Dobbin parted good friends. Unknown to George, the rest of his family, particularly his father, had found an heiress for him, and was certain that there was no possibility that the lady, Miss Swartz, would be turned down. She was brought to the Osborne house, where George discovered that she already knew Amelia. "So you are a friend of Amelia's," George commented. "God bless you for it. She's the best." "You know you are not to speak about her, George," cried Jane Osborne. "Your father forbids it." "Who's to prevent me?" George cried out. "I will speak of her if I wish. Bankrupt or not, my sisters cannot hold a candle to her. Anybody who speaks kindly of her is my friend, while anybody who speaks against her is my enemy." "George, George," one of his sisters implored. George continued, "I thank everybody who loves Amelia said—" He stopped suddenly as old Osborne entered the room, his face livid with rage. Without another word, they went down to dinner. After dinner came the confrontation. George declared his affection for Amelia, to which his father responded, "I ain't going to have any of this damned sentimental nonsense here, sir. There shall be no beggar marriages in my family. If you choose to fling away 8,000 a year, which you may have for the asking, you may do it, but by Jove, you can then take up your pack and walk out of this house, sir, once and for all. Will you do as I tell you, or not?" "I am not marrying that woman, that heiress," George replied. Mr. Osborne ordered a coach for his son. "I've done it," said George to Dobbin an hour later. He looked pale. "Done what, my boy?" asked Dobbin. George told him what had happened between his father and himself. "I'll marry her tomorrow," he said with an oath, "for I love her more every day, Dobbin." No communication passed between father and son for some days. The former was sulky at this silence, but not upset, for, as he said, he knew where he could put the screw on George and only waited patiently for the result. One gusty, raw day in April, Captains Dobbin and Osborne set off about midday to a chapel on the Fulham Road. On their arrival, they heard a greeting, "Here you are," from Jos Sedley. "You're 5 minutes late, George, my boy. What a day, eh? It's like the beginning of the rainy season in Bengal. Come along, my mother and Emmy are already in the vestry." George was pale and nervous. As the marriage service went on, Mrs. Sedley sat in a pew and whimpered a great deal, consoled by her Irish servant. Old Sedley would not be present, so Jos acted for his father, giving away the bride, whilst Captain Dobbin stepped up as groomsman to his friend George. When the service was completed, Jos Sedley came forward and kissed his sister, the bride, for the first time in many months. George's look of gloom had gone, and he seemed proud and radiant. "God bless you, Dobbin," he remarked. His heart was too full to say anything further. After Mrs. Sedley had taken an hysterical adieu of her daughter, William Dobbin put the weeping old lady, her servant and Jos into the carriage and left them without another word. George and Amelia were married and happy. Never since he was a boy had Dobbin felt so miserable and lonely. He longed with a heartsick yearning for the first few days to be over, so that he might see her again. Our young bride and groom had chosen Brighton as the place where they would spend the first few days after their marriage, and they enjoyed themselves there in great comfort and quietude until Jos joined them. Nor was he the only companion they found there. As they were coming into the Ship Inn from a seaside walk one afternoon, whom should they see but Rebecca and her husband? Rebecca flew into the arms of her dearest friend. Crawley and Osborne shook hands together cordially enough. These two young couples had plenty of news to tell each other. George's marriage was to be made known to his father by his friend Captain Dobbin, and young Osborne trembled at the thought. Miss Crawley, on whom all Rawdon's hopes depended, still held out. Barred from his aunt's house in Park Lane, her affectionate nephew and his wife had followed her to Brighton, where they had emissaries continually waiting at her door. The two pairs of newlyweds met frequently in each other's apartments. One evening the three gentlemen walked down to see the lightning coach come in. "Hullo, there's old Dobbin!" cried George, quite delighted to see his old friend. "Here you are, old fellow," he continued. "Glad you've come down. Emmy'll be delighted to see you. What's the news? Have you been to Russell Square? What does the governor say? Tell me everything." Dobbin looked pale and grave. "I've seen your father," he said. "How's Amelia, Mrs. Osborne? Presently I'll tell you everything. But the most important news is that we're ordered to Belgium. The entire army is going. O'Dowd is in command, and we embark from Chatham next week." This news of war came as a shock to our lovers and caused the gentleman to look very serious. Dobbin went on to say that he had called in at Russell Square and spoken to Miss Osborne about marriage in the regiment. At length, following further polite conversation, he considered that Miss Osborne was sufficiently prepared to receive the news. George has not given up Amelia. In fact, he is married to her, and then he related the circumstances of the marriage. Thinking that the news he had brought would be told to the other ladies in the next 5 minutes, Captain Dobbin took his leave. He was scarcely out of the house before the sisters were informed. Dobbin rushed to the city to perform the most difficult part of the task he had undertaken. The idea of facing old Osborne made him nervous. At first he was greeted cordially, since Mr. Osborne believed Dobbin was bringing word of his son's surrender. As he introduced the subject of Amelia, poor Dobbin had to withstand the man's insults aimed at both the family and Amelia herself, and felt the rage gathering inside him. He finally replied, "Sir, no man shall abuse that lady in my hearing, and you least of all. Mr. Osborne, you are talking of the best creature in the world. You had best spare her your insults, sir, for she is your son's wife." And with this, feeling that he could say no more, Dobbin left Osborne, who sank back into his chair and stared wildly about him. Outside, Dobbin asked the old clerk Chopper to keep him informed of progress. After dinner that evening, Mr. Osborne retired to his study and, collecting all the papers relating to George together, locked them away in a writing box. He took down the family Bible and turned the fly-leaf on which he had recorded his marriage, his wife's death, and the birthdays of his children. Taking a pen, he obliterated George's name and restored the volume to its rightful place. Minutes later, he burned his will in the grate. Arriving at the Ship Inn at Brighton, Dobbin assumed a jovial and rattling manner. He was trying to hide his own private feelings. It was agreed between Dobbin and Osborne that they would present the duty of the regiment in Belgium in a harmless light to Amelia. However, Rebecca quickly understood the true nature of their secret. Dobbin was so honest that her arts and cajoleries did not affect him, but nonetheless he shrank from her with an instinctive repulsion, albeit she was very respectful and cordial towards him. Rawdon Crawley paid scarcely any attention to Dobbin, looking upon him as a good-natured nincompoop and underbred city man. Dobbin informed George that his father had granted him only £2,000 in settlement of his inheritance from his mother's will, and the couple were not to receive a penny more. There was no longer a welcome for George in the Osborne household. Now, although Rebecca and her husband were but a stone's throw away from the lodgings which the invalid Miss Crawley occupied, the old lady's door remained firmly closed to them in Brighton as it had been in London. Rawley began to despair. "We might as well be in London as here," he often said with a downcast look. "A comfortable inn in Brighton is better than a destitute house," his wife answered. "Think of those 2 sheriff's assistants who watched our lodgings for a week." "I wonder the writs haven't followed me down here," Rawdon continued. "When they do, we'll find some means to give the bailiffs the slip," said the dauntless Becky, pleased that their meeting with Joss and Osborne had brought them a little money. "It will scarcely be enough to pay the bill at this inn," grumbled Rawdon. "Why need we pay it?" asked his wife in reply. The following day, the entire party assembled for a farewell breakfast. Rebecca took a most tender leave of Amelia and hung on to her friend's neck as if they were parting for ever. As the carriage drove off with the newlyweds, Becky returned to the breakfast table and asked her husband to write a pretty little letter to Miss Crawley. So Rawdon sat down and wrote Brighton, Thursday, and my dear aunt, with great rapidity. But there the gallant officer's imagination failed him, and he looked up at his wife, who could not help laughing at him. Once recovered, she paced the room and dictated a letter which asked Miss Crawley to be reconciled with her nephew before he left on the campaign which would, quite possibly, be fraught with danger. A little later, when Miss Crawley had listened to the letter being read out by Briggs, she said, "Don't you see, old goose, that Rawdon never wrote a word of it? He never wrote to me without asking for money in his life. It is that little serpent of a governess that rules him. They are all alike," Miss Crawley thought, at heart. "They all want me dead, and they all want my money." Then she paused. "I don't mind seeing Rawdon as long as there is no scene, but I draw the line at seeing Mrs. Rawdon." The old lady duly made her arrangements and met Rawdon on the cliff. Rawdon turned scarlet, so great was his rapture and confusion at their meeting. Afterwards, Miss Crawley gave some thought to a further meeting with her nephew, but concluded a letter would be sufficient and would prevent any strong emotions affecting her. She therefore instructed Mrs. Bute Crawley to say that she must decline any further interviews because of her health, to thank Rawdon for coming to Brighton, and to wish him bon voyage. She added that if he would call at her lawyer's in London, he would find a communication awaiting him. Yes, that will do, she concluded. That will make him leave Brighton. The spinster's refusal of a complete reconciliation was thus tempered by the apparent promise contained in the last paragraph of the letter, which indeed made Rawdon eager to return to London. The next morning, Rawdon returned furious from Gray's Inn. "By Jove, Becky," he shouted, "she's only given me £20. Though it was at their expense, the joke was too good, and Becky burst out laughing at Rawdon's discomfort. Once George had reached London, he took lavish rooms in a fine hotel in Cavendish Square. On the following day he dispatched Amelia with carte blanche to purchase everything that was necessary to a lady of Mrs. George Osborne's standing. George, meanwhile, went to Bedford Row to collect the cheque for £2,000, which he cashed immediately. He gloated over the money. He had never seen such a sum before. That same day he paid off his creditors and all of Amelia's costs with the munificence of a lord. He then took Joss's carriage to Chatham. The first face Amelia recognized when they reached there was that of Captain Dobbin. Alongside the captain was Ensign Stubble, who exclaimed, "By Jove, what a pretty girl," on seeing Mrs. Osborne, and it soon became the fashion among the company to adore and admire Mrs. Osborne. 2 days later, the transports went down the river to proceed by convoy to Ostend. At the same time, Joss accompanied the two captains' wives down to Ramsgate, where there were plenty of packets waiting, and in one of which they made a speedy passage to Ostend. The flat, flourishing country of Belgium could not have looked more prosperous than it did in that summer of 1815, when its green fields and quiet cities were enlivened by multitudes of redcoats. Alarm was unknown, and our travellers were entirely at ease. The famous regiment marched to Brussels. Joss accompanied the ladies in extreme comfort, and when they arrived in Brussels, the utmost confidence reigned. Napoleon would soon be defeated by the unconquerable armies. Meanwhile, the business of life and living and the pursuit of pleasure went on as if they had no end and that there was no army ahead. So it was that our travellers found themselves in one of the most brilliant capitals in Europe, where Vanity Fair booths were laid out with the most tempting liveliness and splendour. For some weeks Amelia resided in a handsome lodging where the expenses were borne by Joss and Osborne, who was flush with money and full of kind attentions to his wife. For about a fortnight, Mrs. Amelia was as pleased and happy as any little bride out of England. Her letters home to her mother were filled with delight and gratitude. Joss hired a pair of horses for his open carriage, in which he made an impressive figure on their drives about Brussels. One morning, Joss and Amelia went out for a ride in the park, and among a small troop of horsemen was Rebecca by the side of the gallant General Tufnell. Although she herself did not make for the carriage, Rawdon Crawley rode out of the ranks and greeted Amelia. George and Amelia were invited to visit Rawdon, now General Tufnell's aide-de-camp, and Rebecca in their apartments. Amelia's manners were such when she and George visited Crawley and his wife that they very nearly quarrelled. George scolded his wife for her evident unwillingness to go, and the high and mighty manner in which she presented herself to her old friend. Rebecca was doubly affectionate and would not take notice of her friend's coolness. "I think Emmy has become prouder since her father's name was in since Mr. Sedley's misfortunes," she remarked, and paid court to George for the whole of the evening. George was not in the least bit angry at this. He was not even angry with himself. "It is a shame," he admitted, "but if a pretty young woman will throw herself in your way, why, what can a fellow do? I am rather free with women," he often told his comrades, and they rather respected him for his prowess. Since George was convinced in his own mind he was something of a lady-killer, he did not resist his fate, rather yielding himself up to it quite willingly. Over the next 2 weeks, Emmy did not say much of the affair or plague him with her jealousy, but merely became unhappy, pining miserably in secret. George chose to fancy that she was not suspicious of what all his friends were well aware of, namely, that he was carrying on a desperate flirtation with Mrs. Crawley. One evening, George thought over his brief married life. In a short time, he had frittered away his limited capital. How wild and reckless he had been, how unworthy he was of Emmy. Why had he married her? He was not fit for marriage. Why had he disobeyed his father, who had always been so generous to him? Hope, remorse, ambition, tenderness, and selfish regret filled his heart. Eventually, he sat down and wrote to his father. When the news finally arrived that the campaign was to open and the troops were to march to the front, Rawdon became very serious. "Don't suppose I'm afraid, Becky," he said, "but I'm a pretty good target, and if a shot should bring me down, I'd leave behind me one or two I would like to see provided for. We must make the best of what we've got, Becky." He then proceeded to make a list of his possessions and told her how they might be turned into money in case an accident should befall him. Rebecca wisely decided not to give way to sentimentality on her husband's departure. She waved goodbye to him from an upstairs window and stood for a minute looking after him. She was still in her pretty ball dress, her fair hair hanging on her neck, and the circles round her eyes dark with fatigue. "What a fright I must seem," she said to herself, "and how pale this pink makes me look." So she took off the garment. In doing so, a note fell out of her corsage, which she picked up with a smile and locked into her dressing box. Next, she took up her bouquet and recalled the previous night. The Duchess of Richmond had given a ball, soon to be famous, and in that brilliant assembly, Rawdon Crawley's wife was commended on all sides. Her dress was extremely elegant, and her manner such that it was as though she had moved in such high social circles all her life. Throughout, Amelia sat by herself, while George had sought out Rebecca, the centre of an admiring throng. After enduring agonies of humiliation, neglected, forlorn, the poor girl begged the faithful Dobbin to take her home. Rebecca put her bouquet into a glass of water, went to bed, and slept very comfortably. The following morning she reviewed her position. Should the worst happen, all things considered, she would be pretty well off. She passed the morning seeing to her properties in a most agreeable manner. Among the notes in Rawdon's pocket-book was a £20 draft from Osborne's banker in settlement of a gambling debt. This made her think of George, and so she decided to visit Emmy. Joss, like the other non-combatants, was to be left behind. Early that morning his sleep had been disturbed by the sound of bugles, and he would no doubt have slept on had it not been for a visit by Captain Dobbin. I didn't like to go off without saying goodbye. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Joss asked. "We march in a quarter of an hour's time, Sedley, and neither George nor I may ever come back. You are to stay here and watch over your sister and comfort her and see that no harm comes to her. If anything happens to George, remember she has no one in the world but you to look to. Promise me you will never desert her. As far as money goes, I know you are always so free with it, but are you sure you have enough to get you back to England?" "Sir, when I want money, I know where to ask for it, and as for my sister, I don't need you to tell me how I ought to behave towards her." "You speak like a man of spirit, Joss, and I am glad that George can leave Amelia in such good hands. So may I give him your word that you'll stand by her?" Of course," replied Joss. Dobbin caught sight of Amelia once more before he left. He caught a glimpse of her face in George's room, and what a face it was! So white, so wild, so despair-stricken, that the memory of it haunted him for a long time afterwards, and the sight struck him with inexpressible longing and pity. He stood for a moment and looked at her. Then George came out and led her back into the bedroom, from which he returned alone. The parting had taken place in a moment. Thank heaven that is over, George thought, bounding down the stairs and out to where his regiment was mustering. The sun was just rising as the march began. It was an impressive spectacle, and the men's feelings were a mixture of eagerness and excitement. George marched at the head of his company. He glanced up and smiled at Amelia, then passed on. The sound of music slowly died away into the distance. Jos was pleased at George's departure. He won't be troubling me this morning, he thought, with his dandified airs and his impudence. During that morning, the cook consoled her mistress more than anybody Amelia was to see that wretched morning. During the course of the day, Jos' servant Isidore brought news that the Duke of Wellington had gone to rally his army, the advance of which had been utterly crushed the night before. Jos proclaimed that Napoleon would be defeated. "We are 3-1, sir, against any force that Boney can bring into the field, and now the Austrians and the Russians are on the march." "Ah," replied Isidore, "the Prussians were defeated at Jena, and the Russians will withdraw. No quarter is to be given to the English. Look, here it is in black and white, the Emperor's proclamation." He thrust the document into his master's face. Jos was disturbed and called for his coat and hat. Rebecca arrived to find Jos struggling with the coat. "Are you preparing to join the army, Mr. Joseph?" she asked. "Is there to be nobody left in Brussels to protect us poor women? How cool and collected you look when everybody else is frightened." She paused. "And how is our dear little Emmy? It must have been an upsetting parting." "Tremendously," agreed Jos. "But you men can bear anything. Parting or danger are nothing to you. Oh, dear Mr. Sedley, I have come to you for comfort, for consolation." "My dear madam, don't be alarmed. My duty keeps me here. I can't leave that poor creature in the next room." He motioned to Amelia's door. "Good, noble brother," Rebecca responded. "I have done you an injustice. You have got a heart. Previously, I thought you did not have one." "You do me an injustice indeed, you do, my dear Mrs. Crawley." Rebecca continued in her praises of Jos, and there is no knowing to what declarations of love and ardour the tumultuous passions of Mr. Joseph might have led him if Isidore had not then reappeared. Rebecca thought it was time to go and comfort Amelia. Rebecca's appearance struck Amelia with terror and made her shrink back. She remembered the previous evening. After this initial terror had subsided, a feeling of anger followed, and her face flushed. "Dearest Amelia, you look very unwell," said her visitor. "What is it?" Amelia drew back. "Why are you here, Rebecca?" She must have seen him give me the letter at the ball, Rebecca thought. "Don't be upset, Amelia. I came to see if you are all right." "Are you well?" replied Amelia. "I dare say you are. You don't love your husband, and you would not be here if you did. When you were quite poor, who was it who befriended you? Was I not like a sister to you? You saw us all in happier days before George married me. I meant everything to him then. Otherwise, why would he have given up all he had for me? Why have you come between my love and me? Who sent you to separate those whom God had joined and take my darling husband's heart away from me? His love was everything to me. You knew it, and you wanted to rob me of it. For shame, Rebecca, bad and wicked woman, false friend and false wife." "Amelia, I protest I have done neither mine nor your husband any wrong." "What have I done to you that you should try and take my husband from me? From the day of our wedding you came and blighted my marriage. Now he is gone, you come here to see how unhappy I am. You have made me wretched enough recently. You might have spared me today." "He will come back, my dear," said Rebecca, touched in spite of herself. Amelia picked up George's sash and became lost in thought. Rebecca left the room silently. "How is Amelia?" asked Jos. "There should be somebody with her," replied Rebecca. "I think she is very unwell." She left with a serious look on her face. During dinner, the noise of the cannon nearby caused 1,000 pale and anxious faces to look from their windows. Jos's courage had entirely gone. Once or twice he ventured into his sister's bedroom looking very alarmed, and always about to say something, but he could not bring himself to speak. He was ashamed to tell her that he wanted to flee. But Jos's fears, great as they were already, were to increase to fever pitch before the night was over. The news of Marshal Ney's exploits reached them during the night, and word that Captain Crawley's horses had been left behind reached the Lady Bareacres, who pleaded with Rebecca to sell them to her. She had the pleasure of humiliating an enemy by refusing all assistance, no matter what was offered. It was while Rebecca was enjoying watching the lady in her horseless carriage that she noticed Joss arriving. He was on the lookout for means to escape and told Rebecca so, adding, "Amelia cannot be deserted. There is a seat for her in my carriage and one for you, dear Mrs. Crawley. If I could only get horses," he sighed. "I have two to sell," Rebecca said calmly. Joss could have flung himself into her arms at the news. Rebecca asked him to come into her room, where he followed her quite breathless to conclude the bargain. Joss seldom spent half an hour in his life which cost so much money. He instructed Isidore to saddle the horses at once. Rumours continued to abound that night until the news of the repulse of Marshal Ney at Quatre Bras was received. Amelia was all for going to the army that instant and asked her brother if he would take her there. Joss could not bear seeing her in such a state. He left his sister in charge of her stout companion and went down to the front of the hotel as dawn broke. At daylight, fresh news arrived from the battle as haggard faces looking up from beds of straw-laden carts started to arrive. "Stop, stop!" cried a feeble voice from one as it passed the hotel. It was poor Tom Stubble, wounded by a lancer. "Mr. Sedley! Mr. Sedley!" cried the boy. Amelia rushed down at the sound of his voice and heard that her husband was safe, at which news she fell to her knees and prayed in thanks. That Sunday the cannon of Waterloo began to roar, and when Joss heard that dreadful sound, he made up his mind that he could bear the terror no longer and would fly at once. He rushed into Amelia's room and made an impassioned plea for her to leave. "Without my husband, Joseph?" Amelia asked with a look of wonder. Joss's patience was exhausted. "Goodbye, then," he answered, shaking his fist in rage and slamming the door behind him. Before long, Joseph and Isidore had ridden off. All that day, from morning till past sunset, the cannon never ceased to fire, and it was dark when the cannonading stopped all of a sudden. In Brussels, the sounds of pursuit faded miles away, and night came down on the field and city. Amelia prayed for George, who, at that moment, was lying on his face with a bullet through his heart. During these battles and dangers, old Miss Crawley continued to live in Brighton and was only slightly concerned by the great events that were going on in Europe. However, these events made the newspapers more interesting to her, and Briggs read out a passage in which Rawdon Crawley's gallantry was mentioned with honour and his promotion recorded. "What a pity that that young man has taken such an irretrievable step in the world," his aunt said. "With his rank and distinction, he might have been able to ally himself with one of the best families in England. He would have had my money some day or other, or his children would. But instead of that, he's doomed to be a pauper with a dancing girl as his wife." During Miss Crawley's convalescence, only Miss Briggs was allowed into the presence of the invalid. Yet Miss Crawley's relatives did not forget their beloved kinswoman, and by a steady series of tokens, presents, and kind, affectionate messages, they strove to keep themselves alive in her memory. One of these was Rawdon Crawley. A few weeks after Waterloo, the newly promoted colonel sent his aunt a package of relics from the field of battle, together with a dutiful letter. The spinster asked Briggs to write, encouraging him to continue his correspondence, which, she guessed rightly, to have been dictated by Becky. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bute had been packed off to the rectory, having committed the most fatal of errors with regard to her sister-in-law. Not only had she depressed the household with her presence, she had also bored Miss Crawley. As for Sir Pitt, that old wretch had given himself up entirely to bad ways. He went about drunk, and the two daughters of the house of Queen's Crawley were allowed to run about utterly wild until Mrs. Crawley, by threatening the old gentleman, forced them to be sent away to school. Rumour had it that Horrocks, the butler's blousy daughter, had ambitions to be Lady Crawley, and indeed she had achieved no small power in the neglected house in Becky's absence. Miss Crawley pined for London society, but Mr. Creamer, her medical man, would not hear of her returning to her old haunts and dissipation. Therefore she was only too glad to find companionship in Brighton, and Pitt Crawley was graciously invited to come and see his aunt. He came, bringing with him Lady Southdown and her daughter. The Dowager did not say a word about the state of Miss Crawley's soul, but talked with great enthusiasm about the downfall of the monster Bonaparte. As she spoke, Sir Pitt railed in the strongest terms about the faithless conduct of the Allies towards Bonaparte. This admiration for Napoleon raised Sir Pitt immeasurably in Miss Crawley's eyes. At the end of his visit, Miss Crawley spoke to him. "Don't let Lady Southdown come again, Pitt. She's stupid and pompous, like all your mother's family, whom I could never endure. But bring that good, nice-natured little Jane as often as you please." Pitt promised to do so. Thus, not loath to comfort a sick lady, and perhaps not sorry to be freed from the grasp of the serious toadies who gathered around her mother, the pompous Countess, Lady Jane became a regular visitor to Miss Crawley, accompanying her on her drives and passing many evenings with her. Meanwhile, in the dining-room, Pitt, with a paper or book by his side, sipped Madeira, built castles in the air, and thought himself a fine fellow. Moreover, he now considered himself more in love with Jane than anyone else, and slept a great deal on this thought. It must not be imagined that Sir Pitt Crawley's artifice was concealed from his dear relations at the rectory in Queen's Crawley. His success with his aunt made the rector's family furious. During this time, Becky and Rawdon were spending the winter in Paris, in great splendour and gaiety. Rebecca was a good economist, and the price poor Joss Sedley had paid for her 2 horses was sufficient to keep their little establishment afloat for a year at least. Her success in Paris was remarkable. All the French ladies found her charming, and she spoke their language admirably. They invited the colonel's wife into their salons. A great Parisian lady took it upon herself to write to the eminent Miss Crawley, describing the life of her nephew and the success of Mrs. Crawley. The old spinster's fury was beyond bounds at receiving this communication, particularly in view of how her own name had been used to gain entry to Parisian society. She instructed Bridge to dispatch a furious answer to the lady, repudiating Mrs. Rawdon Crawley altogether, and warning the public to beware of her as a most artful and dangerous person. The letter was in English, and Madame the Duchess, the recipient, who had only been in England 20 years, did not yet understand a word of the language. In consequence, at her next meeting with Mrs. Crawley, she announced that she had received a charming letter from her cher aunt, and that it was most benevolent in tone. Becky now began to think seriously that the spinster would relent. Throughout the winter, her wit, talent, and energy merited a place of honour in Vanity Fair. In the spring of 1816, the following announcement was published. On March 26th, the wife of Lieutenant Crawley of the Life Guards Grey was delivered of a son and heir. This event even reached the London papers and was read out to Miss Crawley. This news caused a crisis in the affairs of the Crawley family. The spinster's rage rose to a new height, and she immediately sent for Pitt, her nephew, and for the Lady Southdown. She requested an immediate celebration of the marriage which had been so long pending between the two families. She further announced that it was her intention to allow the young couple 1,000 a year during her lifetime, at the expiration of which the bulk of her property would be settled on her nephew and her dear niece, Lady Jane Crawley. Once married, Pitt and his wife came to live with Miss Crawley. The news which the famous Gazette had brought to the Osbornes shocked the family. The girls indulged in unrestrained grief. Their gloom-stricken old father was made still more depressed by this loss and sorrow. He tried to think that a judgment had been visited upon his boy for his disobedience. Yet sometimes a shuddering terror struck him, as if he had been the author of the doom he had called down on his son. There was no hope of reconciliation now. Whatever his feelings may have been, the old man had no confidant. About 3 weeks after the sad news, Sir William Dobbin brought a letter for Osborne. The latter's looks frightened the ambassador, and he hurried away without a further word. The letter was in George's handwriting, and had been written just before he took leave of Amelia. The poor boy's letter did not say much, for he had been too proud to acknowledge the tenderness which his heart felt. He only said that on the eve of a great battle he wished to bid his father farewell, and solemnly implored his best wishes for his wife, and perhaps for the child he might be leaving behind him if he fell. He admitted with contrition that he had already wasted a large part of his mother's bequest. Mr. Osborne let go of the letter with the bitterest feelings of balked affection and revenge. Although his son was still beloved, he remained unforgiven. Afterwards, the Osborne girls asked themselves, will he forgive Mrs. George? Toward the end of the autumn, the sisters' anxiety concerning the possible recognition of Amelia as daughter of the family was increased by their father's announcement that he was going abroad. He did not say where, but they knew at once that he would be making his way to Belgium, since George's widow was still in Brussels. They had news of Amelia from Lady Dobbin and her daughters. The honest captain had been promoted to major and awarded the Companion of the Bath. Osborne found his son's unit easily and made a tour of Waterloo and Quatre Bras, accompanied by a sergeant. It was Major Dobbin who took the captain's body to Brussels, the sergeant said, and had him buried, as your honour knows. The father proceeded to his son's graveside. Dobbin chanced to see the old man and followed him to his hotel, where he informed Mr. Osborne that he had a message from his son. Make it short, sir. I am here as George's closest friend, the Major said, and the executor of his will. He made it before he went into action. Are you aware how little he had in the present financial circumstances of his widow? I don't know his widow, sir. Let her return to her father. Ignoring his remarks, Dobbin continued, are you aware, sir, of Mrs. Osborne's condition? Her life and her reason have all but left her as a result of the blow that has befallen her. She will be a mother soon. Will you forgive their child, if only for poor George's sake? Mr. Osborne declared that George should take the consequences of his own folly. He continued that he was a man of his word, and had sworn never to speak to the woman or recognize her as her son's wife. And that's what you may tell her, he concluded, and that's what I will stick to the last day of my life. There was no hope. Amelia would have to live on her meagre pittance and on such assistance as Joss could give her. In her grief, Amelia never realized how little she had, nor just how much she owed to Dobbin. Money was of no importance to her. After spending months in profound and pitiable sorrow, the day came when she had the child, a little boy, with the blue eyes of his departed father. What a miracle it was to hear its first cry! How she laughed and wept over it! Love and hope revived in her. She was safe. It was worth the long months of dread and doubt to her companions to see her eyes once more showing tenderness. Dobbin brought her back to England to her mother's house. He was the godfather to the child, and saw it as his task to watch over Amelia and her son. Though in time he came to understand all the workings of Amelia's heart, he knew there was no place there for him, and so gently he bore his fate, knowing it and content to bear it. One morning the Major brought presents for the baby George, then about 6 months old. He went upstairs, and once Amelia had laid aside the infant, said, I've come to say goodbye, Amelia. Goodbye? Where are you going? India. From now on, send your letters to my agents in Madras, and they will forward them to me. You will write to me, won't you? I shall be away a long time. I'll write to you about Georgie, she replied. Dear William, how good you have been to him and me. Look at him, isn't he an angel? She looked up with bright maternal pleasure. The cruellest looks could not have wounded Dobbin more than that glance of hopeless kindness. He bent over the child and mother, unable to speak for a moment. It was only by summoning all his strength that he could force himself to say God bless you. God bless you, replied Amelia, and held up her face and kissed him. Hush, don't wake Georgie, she added as William Dobbin went towards the door with heavy steps. She did not hear the noise of his carriage leaving. She was once more absorbed in looking at the child. Some 3 or 4 years after his stay in Paris, Rawdon Crawley and his wife were living in a very small but comfortable house in Curzon Street, Mayfair. For 2 or 3 years, Crawley and his wife had lived happily and comfortably in Paris on nothing a year. During this period, he left the Guards and bought his way out of the army. Now, while he lived on nothing a year, he did have a great skill in games of chance. In time, Mrs. Crawley's house began to have an unfortunate reputation as an attractive place for losers in such games. So, in spite of Rawdon's constant successes, Rebecca considered their position precarious, but she also acknowledged that with no visitors, their capital would soon dwindle to 0. She saw that she must now advance Rawdon's fortunes in their own country. At this time news arrived which was spread among Colonel Rawdon's many creditors in Paris, and which caused them immense satisfaction. Miss Crawley, the rich aunt from whom he expected his great inheritance, was dying. The Colonel must hasten to her bedside. Mrs. Crawley and her child would remain behind until he came to reclaim them. But since he owed more money in London than in Paris, Rawdon decided to settle in Brussels until Miss Crawley passed on. When she knew her aunt was dead, Mrs. Crawley ordered the most intense mourning for herself and little Rawdon. The Colonel, she said, was busy arranging the matter of the inheritance. Mrs. Crawley proceeded to England, leaving her son in the care of a nurse. The object of her journey to London was to effect a compromise with her husband's numerous creditors by offering them each a percentage of their total debt to secure Rawdon's return to his own country. In time, she brought the Colonel's creditors to unanimously accept her proposals and purchased, with £1,500, 10 times that amount of debt. This done, she returned to the Continent to rejoin her husband and her son and acquaint the former with the glad news of his liberation. And so Colonel and Mrs. Crawley settled in London. The owner of the house in Curzon Street owed his entire fortune to Miss Crawley, and was therefore willing to let the house and even serve as butler to the new occupants. Rawdon and his wife immediately extended their interest in family connections and gave their patronage to all the tradesmen who had served Miss Crawley. However, all the servants continued to be owed the greater part of their wages, and so were thereby interested in maintaining the house with a view to a settlement. Rebecca's wit, cleverness, and flippancy made her speedily the vogue among a certain class. It must be confessed, however, that the ladies held aloof from her, and their doors remained firmly shut to our little adventurer. At first, Rawdon was acutely sensitive to these slights and was inclined to be gloomy as a result. But Becky would say, "All the rage in the world won't get your aunt's money. It is much better that we should be friends with your brother's family than enemies. When your father dies, Queen's Crawley will be a pleasant home for us to pass the winter in. We shall have as many friends as we want in due course, but in the meantime you must obey me. While there is life, there is hope, my dear, and I intend to make a man of you yet. Who sold the horses for you? Who paid your debts for you?" Rawdon was obliged to confess that he owed all these benefits to his wife, and agreed to entrust himself to her guidance for the future. When Miss Crawley left the world, the money was finally left to Pitt. Rawdon wrote kindly letters to his brother, offering his congratulations. Pitt Crawley received the letters graciously, while Lady Jane was so charmed by them, she expected her husband to divide his aunt's legacy in half and send it to his brother. To her ladyship's surprise, however, Pitt declined to accommodate his brother with a cheque for £30,000, but instead offered a reconciliation. Becky was delighted with this news for reasons of her own. When Lady Jane arrived, she thought, she shall be my sponsor in London society. And as for the other women, bah! By this time, Jos had returned to India. Before doing so, he became his father's support, for fortune had not returned to the feeble and stricken old man. It was old Sedley's delight to take his little grandson out at weekends to the parks. Between Mrs. Sedley and her daughter there was a sort of coolness about this boy, and a secret jealousy, which arose from Mrs. Sedley having given the boy a medicine which Amelia declared to be a poison. Until the end of her life, this breach between Mrs. Sedley and her daughter was never thoroughly mended. The boy was Amelia's treasure, the more so as he grew more like his father. She constantly told him about this dead father and spoke of her love for George to the innocent and wondering child. On the 25th of April and the 18th of June, the days of her marriage and widowhood, she would stay in her room, consecrating these days to the memory of George. Besides her pension of £50 a year, there had been the £500 which was left by Osborne's estate, which Dobbin proposed to invest for her. Mr. Sedley disputed the plan and went to Dobbin and told the Major that he was unlawfully retaining his late son-in-law's money. Dobbin relented, but never once did old Sedley think of the expenses that the Major had paid on Osborne's behalf after his death. 2 or 3 times a year Amelia wrote to Dobbin in Madras, letters all about little Georgie. How he treasured them. In turn, he sent endless gifts to his godson and to her. "What a pity it is she won't think of him," commented Mrs. Sedley at this profusion of gifts. "It is evident that the Major is head over heels in love with her, and yet whenever I so much as hint at it, she turns red and begins to cry and sits upstairs with her miniature of Osborne." Dobbin began to write frequently to Georgie when he grew to about 6 years old. The Major was always thinking about Amelia and the boy. Sometimes, no doubt at the Major's prompting, his sisters would call with the family carriage to take Amelia and the little boy for a drive. One day they kindly came over to Amelia with news they were sure would delight her, something very interesting about their dear William. What was it? Was he coming home? She asked with pleasure. "Oh, no, not in the least, but we have good reason to believe that William is about to be married to Georgina O'Dowd, Sir Michael O'Dowd's sister, who is also out in Madras." Amelia simply said, "Oh," at this news. Mrs. Bute, after the first shocks of rage and disappointment at the destiny of Miss Crawley's legacy, at length took comfort in the result. "At least the money will remain in the family," she said. "Pitt will never spend it, for there's not a greater miser in the whole of England." Sir Pitt's dislike for respectable society increased with age, and his gates had not been opened to a gentleman's carriage since Pitt and Lady Jane came to pay a visit soon after their marriage. Poor Lady Crawley's rose garden became the dreariest wilderness. Only 2 or 3 domestics remained in the bleak old servants' hall. The stables and offices were vacant and half ruined. Sir Pitt lived in private and drank every night with Horrocks or his butler. The old man quarrelled with his agents and threatened his tenants. Nothing had any effect on him. The reprobate simply laughed at everything. He was in great spirits one night and drank an extraordinary quantity of rum and water with the butler until a very late hour. Soon afterwards there was a great hurry and bustle in the house. Lights went about from window to window in the lonely, desolate hall. Presently a boy on a pony went galloping to the doctor's house. In another hour Mrs. Bute Crawley and her husband, the Reverend, and their son James walked through the park and entered the mansion. Their entrance surprised Betsy Horrocks, who was attempting to force open the desks and cupboards in Sir Pitt's study. Mrs. Bute declared to James, "Put that woman in the strong room. We caught her in the act of robbing Sir Pitt. Mr. Crawley, you'll make out her committal, and you, Beddoes, will take her over to Southampton jail tomorrow." With this, the unfortunate Horrocks was led out. Early the next morning, an express coach was sent to Mr. Pitt Crawley by Mrs. Bute, who had assumed command of everything and who had watched over the old baronet during the night. The heir of Crawley arrived in due course, and may be said to have reigned from that time on at Queen's Crawley. For, though the old baronet survived many months, he never recovered the use of his intellect or his speech completely, and the government of the estate devolved on his elder son. Mr. Pitt's whole family was brought there. Mrs. Bute's intentions regarding Betsy Horrocks were not carried into effect. She and her father left the hall when her father took possession of the Crawley Arms in the village, having been given the lease by Sir Pitt. Lady Southdown, though installed, soon had limits set on her sphere of influence by Mrs. Bute, which was a great comfort to Pitt Crawley. As for Sir Pitt, he retired into those very apartments where Lady Crawley had passed away, and here he was constantly tended by Miss Hester. At last a day came when the nurse's task was over. Early one morning, as Pitt Crawley was at his books in the study, Hester presented herself. "If you please, Sir Pitt died this morning, Sir Pitt." "Then I'll start reviving the estate now with the ready money," Pitt thought, and rapidly calculated its encumbrances and the list of improvements he would make. All the blinds were pulled down at the hall and rectory. The church bell was tolled. Pitt was determined to treat his family kindly and respectably, and make a house of Queen's Crawley once more. It pleased him to think that he should be its head. He proposed to use his influence in the county to get his brother placed and his cousins decently provided for. He determined to rule justly and honestly, to depose Lady Southdown, and to be on the friendliest possible terms with all his blood relations. So he dictated a letter to his brother Rawdon. This elaborate letter, with a huge black border and seal, was accordingly dispatched to the Colonel in London. Rawdon was only half pleased at receiving it. "What's the use of going down to that stupid place?" he thought. "I can't stand being alone with Pitt after dinner, and to take horses there and back will cost us £20. He took the letter to Becky, who read it and shouted, "Hooray!" waving the note round her head. "You don't mean you'll go?" asked Rawdon. "Of course I mean to go. Lady Jane shall present me at court next year, and your brother will give you a seat in Parliament, you stupid old creature. Lord Steyne shall have your vote, and his, my dear. You'll be an Irish secretary or West Indies governor or something." The appointed morning came, and, suitably dressed in mourning, the couple made their way down to Queen's Crawley. They soon met the rest of the family, and within half an hour Becky and Lady Jane were close and intimate friends. In the course of the evening, her ladyship informed Sir Pitt that she thought her new sister-in-law was kind, frank, and an unaffected and affectionate young woman. Having so easily won his daughter's goodwill, the indefatigable little woman busied herself with a recommendation to the august Lady Southdown. Sir Pitt recalled that it was his brother's marriage to which he owed his fortune, and he, at least, should not criticize it. His satisfaction at this thought was not lessened by Rebecca's behaviour and talk, for she was able to charm him and encourage his conversational powers. With her sister-in-law, Rebecca was of the opinion that it had been Mrs. Bute who had had the highest hopes of the fortune, and that she had deprived Rawdon of his inheritance by inventing wicked reports about her. All these speeches were dutifully reported back to Sir Pitt. The funeral took place for the late Sir Pitt Crawley in the bright sunshine. Rawdon Crawley stayed on afterwards and became almost a creditable younger brother to Sir Pitt. He received little messages from his son in London at regular intervals which read, "I am very well, I hope you are very well, I hope Mamma is very well, the pony is very well." The baronet promised to take charge of the lad at school, and his kind-hearted wife gave Rebecca a banknote, begging her to buy a little present for her little nephew. One day followed another, and the ladies of the house passed their life in those calm pursuits and amusements which satisfy country ladies. During her stay at Queen's Crawley, Rebecca made as many friends as she could possibly bring under her control. Eventually, Lady Jane and her husband bade her farewell with the warmest demonstrations of goodwill. "How happy you will be when you see your darling little boy again," Lady Crawley remarked. "Oh, so happy," replied Rebecca. Although she was immensely happy to be free of the place, she was also loath to go. Despite Queen's Crawley being awful, the air was somehow purer than that which she had been accustomed to breathe. Everybody had been dull, but nevertheless been kind in their own way. Old Mr. Osborne was not the happiest of mortals. He made his clerks' lives a misery, and his family at home were not much happier. He had proposed to Miss Swartz, but had been rejected. With her sister Maria married, Jane Osborne scarcely ever met a man under 60. There had been a secret liaison in Jane's life, which made her father more savage and morose than even his pride and overfeeding normally had made him, and she was not allowed to have a companion afterwards. Her father swore that she should not have a shilling of his money if she made any match without his consent, and since he needed a woman to keep his house, he did not choose that she should marry. So she resigned herself to being an old maid, while her sister was having children with finer names every year. The Mrs. Dobbins kept Miss Osborne up to date with news of Amelia. One day Mrs. Osborne allowed little George to go and spend a day with the Mrs. Dobbin at Denmark Hill, while she spent part of that day writing to the Major in India. She congratulated him on his engagement and prayed for the prosperity of the couple. She was glad to be able to admit how warmly she regarded Major Dobbin. This letter put the recipient into such a state of mind that his intended, her pink satin, and everything belonging to her became perfectly odious to him. Everything annoyed the Major that day. He was more wretched and lonely than ever, and he lay sleepless all that night, yearning to go home. Amelia could not see that he loved her. He read over and over again the letters he had had from her. A second package of letters arrived the next day, but he left them unread for 3 days since they were from his sister. Finally, he looked at them. An hour later, he could be seen rushing towards the commanding officer's compound, calling out, "Colonel O'Dowd!" Glorvina opened an upstairs window. "Heavens, Major," she called. "What is the matter, Dobb, old boy?" asked the colonel. "I must have a leave of absence. I must go to England on the most urgent private affairs." His sister's letter announced that Mr. S. was now quite definitely bankrupt, and it went on to say that Mrs. Osborne was now considering giving up her son to Mr. Osborne's care, since she was about to be married to a reverend gentleman. The renovation of the Crawley family house in Great Gaunt Street was decided upon by Sir Pitt Crawley in November. Becky oversaw all the arrangements for the change, during which Sir Pitt resided with her and Rawdon. When he left, Sir Pitt thought to himself how Becky respected him, and how he deserved it, and how Rawdon was a foolish, dull fellow who didn't appreciate his wife, and how dull and stupid his own wife was compared to brilliant little Becky. "Wish I could have got a little money out of him," Rawdon said to his wife moodily once the baronet was gone. "I should have liked to have given something to our landlord." "Tell him," said Becky, "that as soon as Sir Pitt's affairs are settled, everyone will be paid, and give him a little something on account. Here's a cheque that Sir Pitt left for the boy." Although Pitt Crawley thought he would do something for his brother, he had decided that he would think about it some other time. Becky herself was quite content with all that Sir Pitt Crawley had done for her. She was acknowledged by the head of the family. If she got no actual money from her brother-in-law, she got what was as good as money: credit. As little Crawley grew to be 8 years old, his attachment to his mother ended as his original matronal vision faded away. For 2 years, Becky had scarcely spoken to the child. She disliked him, for he bored her. The knowledge that the boy was in the house was painful to her. The very sight of him annoyed her. Lord Steyne also heartily disliked the boy. When they met, he made sarcastic bows or remarks to the child, or glared at him with savage-looking eyes. Meanwhile, his mother continued to push towards a position in society, while the servants considered her lost and ruined. Lord Steyne had become one of the most frequent visitors to her house, and he was immensely rich. His power and influence could open all doors to her, while his notorious reputation in no way made him unwelcome. The friends he brought with him could gamble with Rawdon, who more and more retired into the background. While Rawdon Crawley cut a very poor figure as a husband, the greatest joy of his life was to go upstairs to the nursery to play with his little son. Sir Pitt Crawley had done more than repair fences and restore dilapidated lodges on the Queen's Crawley estate. Like a wise man, he set to rebuild the injured popularity of his house and name. He made it his duty to show himself before the Hampshire public. Lady Jane was instructed to be friendly with the local baronets. The greater part of the altered demeanour and popularity of Sir Pitt Crawley could be traced back to the advice of that astute little lady of Curzon Street. Sir Pitt Crawley, I know your talents and ambitions. You fancy you hide them both, but you can conceal neither from me. The ministry has its eyes on you, and I know what you want. You want to distinguish yourself in Parliament. Everyone says you are the finest speaker in England. And you want to be Baron Crawley of Queen's Crawley, and I'm sure you will be before you die. If I had a husband who possessed your intellect, I think I should not be unworthy of him. I am your kinsman now. I may be poor, but I'm not penniless. I have got a little interest. Who knows, perhaps the mouse may be able to help the lion. Sir Pitt Crawley had been amazed and enraptured with her speech. Before a memorable Christmas was over, the baronet had screwed up courage enough to give his brother another draft on his bankers, and for no less a sum than £100, an act which caused Sir Pitt cruel pangs at first, but which made him glow afterwards to think himself one of the most generous of men. Under Becky's care, the Crawley house in Great Gaunt Street was quite rejuvenated and ready for the reception of Sir Pitt and his family. Lady Jane's sweetness and kindness had inspired Rebecca with such a contempt for her ladyship that the little woman found no small difficulty in concealing it. Becky's presence made Lady Jane uneasy. They my-deared and my-loved each other, but kept apart generally, whereas Sir Pitt, in the midst of his multifarious vocations, found time each day to see his sister-in-law. Meanwhile, the ex-colonel would sit for hours in his brother's house, silent, thinking and doing as little as possible. He was beaten, cowed into laziness and submission. The bold and reckless blood of 10 years before was completely subjugated, and now ran through a torpid, submissive, middle-aged, stout gentleman. Out of the small residue of her income which Amelia kept back for herself, the widow had need of all the thrift and care possible in order to enable her to keep her darling boy dressed in such a manner as became George Osborne's son, and to defray the expense of the little school to which the lad had been sent. Georgie had made great progress in the school. At night she would help him in his exercises, and puzzle her head over his lessons as eagerly as if she herself was attending the school. In these quiet labours and harmless cares, the gentle widow's life was passing away, a silver hair or two marking the progress of time on her head, while a line deepened ever so slightly on her forehead. All she hoped for was to live to see her son great, famous, and glorious, as he deserved to be. All her husband's faults and foibles she had buried in the grave with him. She only remembered the lover who had married her at all costs, the noble husband so brave and beautiful, who was to die gloriously for his king. Of late the Misses Dobbin had repeated their entreaties to Amelia to allow Georgie to visit. At last Amelia agreed to their demands, but with a heavy and suspicious heart. Later she welcomed him back as if he was rescued from some danger. She asked whether he had seen any people, He mentioned Sir William and Mr. Dobbin and an old gentleman. Then Amelia knew that the boy had seen his grandfather and waited feverishly for the proposal which she was sure would follow. It arrived a few days later. In it, Mr. Osborne formally offered to take care of the boy and make him heir to the fortune which he had intended his father should inherit. He would also make Mrs. George Osborne an allowance. If she was to marry again, he would not withdraw this allowance, but it must be understood that the child would live entirely with his grandfather in Russell Square, and only occasionally would the child be permitted to see his mother at her own residence. Amelia rose up, trembling and flushing as soon as she read the letter. She tore the paper into 100 fragments which she trod on. She told the messenger, "I marry again. I take money to part with my child. Tell Mr. Osborne it is a cowardly letter. I will not answer it. I wish you good morning, sir." She never mentioned the letter to her parents. About this time, Mr. Sedley embarked on a further scheme, and the bills of their little household fell into arrears. The remittances had not arrived from India, Mr. Sedley told his wife with a disturbed face. With Emmy's contribution, the first 6 months passed by easily enough, while old Sedley maintained that his shares must surely rise, and all would then be well. At the end of the half-year, the household fell deeper and deeper into trouble. At this point, the position was made clear to Amelia, and she handed over all her money, and so was unable to provide Georgie with new clothes for Christmas. Hardest of all, she had to break the news to her son, who made a loud outcry. Everybody had new clothes at Christmas. The others would laugh at him. The poor widow had only kisses to give him. She darned the old suit in tears, then decided to sell the best of her gifts from the Major, for which she received 20 guineas. She used these riches to buy Georgie some books he longed for. Yet, when old Mrs. Sedley saw them and was angry with Amelia for having spent money in that way, Amelia was in despair until she remembered her conviction that the boy would make his fortune. This restored her stricken heart. At last, Becky's kindness and attention to the head of her husband's family was destined to be rewarded. That happy day came when Mrs. Rawdon Crawley was admitted into the paradise of a court which she coveted, with her sister-in-law acting as her godmother. She stepped into Sir Pitt's carriage that day as if she were a princess. Rawdon followed in his old guard's uniform, which had grown woefully shabby and was now much too tight. There were times when Becky believed herself to be a fine lady, and forgot that they had no money, no ground to walk on, as it were. At court her demeanour became so grand, so self-satisfied, so deliberate and so imposing that it made even Lady Jane laugh. Her dress was the most fashionable and brilliant costume, and was as handsome in her eyes as those of the public. She wore diamonds, too. "Where on earth did you get those diamonds, Becky?" asked her husband. Becky and Sir Pitt blushed, for he had given her some of the stones and had not told his wife. "Yes," she said to her husband. "Where do you suppose I got them from? I hired them, except for the small clasp." Afterwards the diamonds were returned to a little oak desk in which Becky kept a number of useful and valuable things of which her husband was not aware. Though Rawdon knew nothing of the diamond's place of origin, Lord Steyne, who came up decorated with all his stars, garters, and collars, and who paid particular attention to the little woman, knew very well where the bulk of her jewels came from, and who had paid for them. In all London there was no more loyal heart than Becky's after her interview with His Majesty. The name of her king was always on her lips, and he was proclaimed by her to be the most charming of men. The finest sport of all after her presentation was to hear her talk virtuously. Being made an honest woman, so to speak, Becky would not consent any longer to converse with the more dubious ones. A few days after the presentation, Lord Steyne called on Becky. "Well," said the old gentleman, "you seem determined to become a fine lady. You pester my poor old life to get you out in the world, but you won't be able to hold your own there, you silly fool. You've got no money. You need to compete with those who have. All women are alike, striving for what is not worth having. You'll go to Gaunt House. You'll give me no rest till I get you there, though it's not half as nice as here. You'll be bored. Anyway, you'll be asked to dinner next week. Look out and hold your own. How the women will bully you. He then complained about poor Briggs, who served in the house, and asked why Becky did not dismiss her. You owe her wages, I suppose? Asked the peer. Worse than that. I have ruined her, but she will never leave me until we are utterly ruined ourselves, which does not seem far off. How much do you need? Asked the lord with an oath. Becky, reflecting on the capacity of his means, mentioned almost double the sum she owed Miss Briggs. This caused Lord Steyne to break out into another tirade. At last he snatched his hat up and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Once he had gone, Rebecca burst out laughing. That night 2 messages arrived from Lord Steyne's residence, Gaunt House. The first was an invitation to dinner, the second a grey slip of paper containing Lord Steyne's signature. Rawdon heard Becky laughing in the night once or twice. The next day she gave Briggs a fine present and gave Mr. Raggles, the landlord, £50 on account. On his return home the previous day, Lord Steyne had insisted that Miss Crawley and her husband be invited to dinner. Lady Gaunt and Lady Steyne protested, but his lordship persisted. The crestfallen women could do nothing but obey. In consequence, the ladies of Gaunt House called on Lady Bareacres for help in order to repulse the common enemy. Other distinguished persons were also invited to the dinner. The Colonel's face on coming into this polite society wore as many blushes as that of a 16-year-old boy who encounters one of his sister's school friends. Becky would have left him at home, but virtue ordained that her husband should be by her side to protect the timid and fluttering creature on her first appearance in polite society. It was after the banquet, and when the ladies were alone, that Becky knew the social difficulties would begin. At first the other ladies did not wish to be near Becky until Lady Steyne pitied her and went over to speak with her. Lord Steyne, she said, says you play and sing very beautifully, Mrs. Crawley. I would like you to do me the kindness of singing for me. I will do anything that would give pleasure to Lord Steyne or yourself, replied Becky gratefully, and seated herself at the piano and began to sing. Although the opposition from the ladies at the other end of the room kept up a loud and ceaseless buzzing and talking, Lady Steyne did not hear. She was a girl once more, and was recalling a brief period of happiness until she was startled by the opening of the doors and laughter as Lord Steyne and the other men of the party entered. Lord Steyne saw at a glance what had happened in his absence and was, for once, grateful to his wife. He went and spoke to her, then turned to Becky. My wife says you have been singing like an angel. However the previous part of the evening had passed, the rest of the night was a great triumph for Becky. She sang her very best, and it was so good that every one of the men came and crowded round the piano, while the women, her enemies, were left quite ignored. We now descend from these genteel heights to the lowly residence of John Sedley at Brompton. Here in this humble tenement live care, distrust, and dismay. Amelia thinks and racks her brains to find some means of increasing the small pittance on which the household is starving. She grows daily more careworn and sad, staring with alarmed eyes upon her child. She sleeps little now. A constant thought and terror is haunting her. How she prays and weeps in the long silent nights. How she tries to hide from herself the thought which recurs, that she ought to part with the boy, that she is the only barrier between him and prosperity. She can't, not now, at least. A thought comes to her which makes her blush. The curate would marry her and give a home to her and the boy. But George's memory and picture are there to rebuke her. This combat lasts many weeks, during which she has no confidant. One truth after another was silently marshalling against her. She had at first written to Joss asking him to repeat the assistance he gave. Although she did not know the truth of the matter, Joss's annuity was still regular, but it had been mortgaged to a moneylender in the city, who now received it. Old Sedley had sold it in order to pursue one of his schemes. One evening Amelia told her father that she had written to Joss about it, and he blurted out the whole truth he had not dared to tell her sooner. With this knowledge, Amelia knew she was conquered. She did not say anything of her grief or position to the boy's godfather, not having written to him since she had heard of his intended marriage. The child must leave her now. She must give up her joy, hope, and treasure. And then she would go to George. Her mind being made up, the widow began to take such measures as seemed right to her for advancing the objective which she now proposed. One day Miss Osborne received a letter from Amelia. In simple terms, the widow gave her the reasons which had induced her to change her mind in respect of the boy. Great as her sufferings would be in being parted from her boy, Amelia knew she would endure them for his sake. She drew some comfort from knowing that those to whom he was going would do all in their power to make him happy. In a postscript she stipulated that she required a written agreement, that she could see the child as often as she wished, and that she would not part from him on any other terms. "What, Mrs. Pride has come down, has she?" old Osborne said when he read the letter. "Ha, ha, I knew she would." He chuckled. He asked his daughter to prepare George's room, which remained as it had been in 1814, then added, "You'd better send that woman some money. She shall want for nothing. Send her £100, but mind she doesn't come here." "Here, Papa, is some money," Amelia said that night, kissing her old father and putting the bill for £100 in his hands. "And, Mamma, don't be harsh with Georgie. He's not going to stay with us much longer." She would say nothing more and walked away silently to her room, closing the door on her prayers and her sorrow. Miss Osborne saw Amelia the following day. George was kept back from school and saw his aunt. Amelia left them alone together and went to her room. The widow broke the news to Georgie with great caution over the next few days. She noticed he was more elated than anything else, and the poor woman turned sadly away. At last the day came for Georgie's departure. He was longing for the change. With 1,000 declarations as to what he would do when he went to live with his grandfather, he had shown his mother how little the idea of parting had upset him. So it was that the child went away smiling while his mother was heartbroken. A few days later, and no angel has intervened, the child is sacrificed and offered up to fate. The widow is left quite alone. The boy comes to see her often, accompanied by Grandfather Sedley. She sees him, but he is not her boy any longer. In a matter of days he has adopted a slightly imperious, patronizing manner. He was born to command, his mother thinks, as his father was before him. After Becky's appearance at Lord Steyne's private and select parties, the claims of that estimable woman as regards fashion were settled, and some of the very greatest and tallest doors of the metropolis were speedily opened to her. The Marquis of Steyne was ever present, paternally superintending the progress of his pupil. Her success excited, elated, and then bored her. At first no occupation had been more pleasant. Becky's former acquaintances hated and envied her. The poor woman herself was yawning in spirit. "I wish I were out of it," she said to Lord Steyne. "I would rather be a parson's wife and teach in a Sunday school than this, or a sergeant's lady and ride in a regimental wagon. Oh, how much better it would be to wear the glitter and trousers and dance before a booth at a fair." "You would do very well," said Lord Steyne, laughing. She used to tell the great man her boredoms and perplexities in her artless way. They amused him. Yet Becky always made a point of being conspicuously polite to the professional ladies and gentlemen who attended those aristocratic parties. How the Crawleys got the money which was spent on the entertainments with which they treated the polite world was a mystery which gave rise to some gossip at the time, and probably added zest to these little festivities. The truth is that by economy and good management, by sparing use of ready money and by paying scarcely anybody, people can manage for a time at least to make a great deal of show with very little means. And it is our belief that Becky's parties cost little. The food and drink were provided by several male acquaintances, free of charge. The French amusement of charades had reached this country and enabled the beautiful ladies to display their charms and a smaller number who had cleverness to exhibit their wit. Lord Steyne was encouraged by Becky to give an entertainment at Gaunt House which was to include some of these little dramas. Rebecca performed her part so well that His Royal Highness insisted on being presented to Mrs. Rawdon Crawley. "Marry someone else, eh?" jested this great personage. Becky laughed, happy and flirting, as she swept the prettiest curtsy ever seen. There was a ball after the dramatic entertainments, and everybody pressed around Becky, who was the centre of attraction that evening. His Royal Highness declared that Becky was perfection itself, and engaged her again and again in conversation. Little Becky's soul swelled with pride and delight at these honours. She saw fortune, fame, fashion before her. Lord Steyne was her slave, following her everywhere, and he scarcely spoke to anyone else in the room. The greatest triumph of all was at supper time. She was placed on the exclusive table with His Royal Highness and the rest of the great guests, and served on gold plate. The ladies at the other tables remarked on Lord Steyne's constant attention to her, and vowed it was a monstrous infatuation, a gross insult to ladies of rank. If sarcasm could have killed, Lady Stunnington would have slain Becky on the spot. Rawdon Crawley was terrified of these triumphs. They seemed to separate him further from his wife, further more than ever. He thought, with a feeling very like pain, how immeasurably she was his superior. When the hour for their departure came, a crowd of young men followed Becky out. Rawdon put his wife into the carriage, which drove off without him. Mr. Wenham proposed to walk Rawdon home. Two others separated from the crowd and followed the first two gentlemen. When they had walked down Gaunt Square, one of these men came up, and touching Rawdon on the shoulder, said, "I beg your pardon, Colonel, I wish to speak to you on a most delicate matter." The gallant officer knew at once what had befallen him. He was in the hands of the bailiffs. He started back. "There are three of us, so it's no use bolting," the man said. "It's you, Moss, is it?" asked the Colonel. "How much?" "Only a small amount," whispered Mr. Moss, an assistant officer to the Sheriff of Middlesex. £160 6 and 8 due under the suit brought by Mr. Nathan. "Lend me 100, Wenham, for God's sake," poor Rawdon begged. "I've got 70 at home." "I've not got £10 in the world," replied the poor Mr. Wenham. "I must now say good night, my dear fellow." "Good night," said Rawdon ruefully, as Wenham walked away. When Lord Steyne was benevolently disposed, he did nothing by halves. His lordship surprisingly extended his goodwill to little Rawdon. He pointed out to the boy's parents the necessity of sending him to a public school. Rawdon at once agreed to part with him and to give up his life's greatest comfort and benefit for the sake of the welfare of the little lad. He did not know how fond he was of the child until it became necessary to let him go away. When he was gone, he felt more sad and downcast than he dared to admit. Becky burst out laughing once or twice when the Colonel, in his clumsy way, tried to express his sorrows at the boy's departure. He did not realize how alone he was until little Rawdon had gone. Young Rawdon's aunt, Lady Jane, was also very fond of the boy, and wept copiously when the time of departure of the lad came round. Becky laughed bitterly at Jane's feelings and softness. The other's kindly and gentle nature could not but be revolted by her sister's callous behaviour. This episode estranged Rawdon from his wife more than he knew. Becky herself was not concerned at this estrangement. Indeed, she did not miss him or anybody. She now looked on him as nothing more than her errand boy and humble slave. She was too busy thinking about her pleasures or her advancement in society to have a care for him. The Colonel went to see his son shortly after he was settled in Whitefriars, and found the boy well and happy, grinning and laughing in his little black gown and breeches. The boy was often allowed home on Saturdays, and Rawdon treated him royally. Meanwhile, Becky's contempt for her husband grew greater every day. Little Rawdon having been taken care of at his expense, Lord Steyne, who took such a parental interest in the affairs of this poor family, thought that their expenses might be reduced by Mrs. Briggs' departure. He considered that Becky was quite clever enough to take on the management of her own home. Lord Steyne discreetly approached Miss Briggs herself, and learned the truth of what happened to the investment of Briggs' legacy of £600 by Mr. and Mrs. Crawley, and the diversion of Lord Steyne's own settlement of Becky's debt to Miss Briggs. Lord Steyne promised he would not divulge Miss Briggs' story. What an accomplished devil she is, he thought. What a splendid actress and manager. She almost got a second supply of cash out of me the other day with her coaxing ways. She beats all the women I have ever seen in the course of my well-spent life. I am a greenhorn in comparison, an old fool in her hands. She is insurpassable in lies. His lordship's admiration for Becky rose immeasurably at this proof of her cleverness. And Crawley, the Lord thought. Crawley is not such a fool as he looks and seems. He's managed the matter cleverly enough on his side. Nobody would ever have supposed from his face and demeanour that he knew anything about this money business. And yet he put her up to it, and spent the money, no doubt. However, though the Lord was mistaken in this, it had a great effect on his behaviour towards Colonel Crawley, whom he now began to treat with a semblance of respect. It never entered the Lord's head that it might be Mrs. Crawley who was making a secret nest egg for herself. When his lordship taxed Becky on this affair of Miss Briggs' money, she protested, amid tears, that it was her husband who had put her up to telling the tale to Lord Steyne, and had forced her to do so by threats. She went on to say that the Colonel had taken the money since she neither wanted nor needed it. The upshot of their conversation was that Becky was able to bring Miss Briggs some very good news, for she was offered the position of housekeeper at Gauntly Hall, Lord Steyne's country house. Briggs' gratitude was ecstatic. When he returned home, Rawdon was glad, since the weight was lifted off his conscience concerning poor Briggs' money. Although she was to be provided for, it did not seem quite right, somehow. He told Lady Jane and Sir Pitt of this event, and both of them were disturbed at Becky's attitude. Sir Pitt paid a visit to Becky and implored her to be more prudent. Society was already gossiping about her. Lord Steyne, though a nobleman of the greatest station and talents, was a man whose attentions could compromise any woman. He commended his sister-in-law to be more watchful. Becky promised anything and everything Pitt wanted, but Lord Steyne came to her house as often as ever, and Sir Pitt's anger only increased. Lord Steyne's visits continuing, his own ceased, though he felt it prudent to accept Lord Steyne's invitation to his Gerard's party, since His Royal Highness was to be present. During this time Rawdon had become a very watchful and exemplary husband. He never left the house alone. He always went with Becky out to drive. He studiously accompanied her to all her parties. Whenever Lord Steyne called, he was sure to find the Colonel. Whenever Becky received invitations for herself or was asked to go out alone, the Colonel ordered her to refuse. And there was something in her husband's manner which made Becky acquiesce. Little Becky, to do her justice, was charmed with Rawdon's gallantry. If he was surly, she never was. She always had a kind smile for him, and was attentive to his pleasure and comfort. It was like the early days of their marriage all over again. Yet when Rawdon fell asleep after dinner, he could not see the face opposite him, haggard, weary, and terrible. But it lit up again with fresh smiles when he awoke. It kissed him gaily. He never had any real suspicions. The doubts gathering in his mind he put down to jealousy. His hope was that she would grow to like the boy. But neither the mother nor the son could ever be brought together. It was while Rawdon was reflecting in this way that the unfortunate Colonel came to find himself a prisoner. He was conveyed to Mr. Moss's dingy house, which, though dirty, was splendid within. The Colonel was given bed and breakfast within this barred and guarded establishment. The following morning he wrote a note to Becky. Dear Becky, I hope you slept well. Don't be worried when I don't bring you in your coffee. Last night as I was coming home, I met with an accident. I was nabbed by Moss of Cursitor Street. It's Nathan's business, 150, with costs 170. Please send me my desk and some clothes. I've 70 in it. As soon as you get this, drive to Nathan's, offer him 75 down and ask him to renew. If he won't stand it, take my ticker and such of your things as you can spare and send them to Ball's. We must have the sum tonight. God bless you. Yours in haste, R.C. P.S. Make haste and come. Rawdon calculated that 3 hours would be needed before a messenger would return from Becky, but the day passed without any news. During the meagre dinner that evening, however, a messenger arrived with a letter from Becky. It said that Lord Steyne would be sending her over the money on the following day. As Rawdon read the letter, he turned red, and everyone present realized that bad news had reached him. All the suspicions which he had been trying to banish had returned. She could not even go out and sell her trinkets to free him. He suspected someone had deliberately had him put into Mr. Moss's hands. He quickly wrote a note to Sir Pitt and Lady Crawley, beseeching his brother and his sister, for the sake of God, for the sake of his dear child and honour, to come and relieve him from his difficulty. An hour later, Lady Jane arrived. Rawdon ran to her and caught her in his arms, gasping out inarticulate words of thanks while sobbing on her shoulder. She did not understand the real cause of his emotion. Mr. Moss's outstanding bills were quickly settled. It was 9 o'clock when Rawdon reached his house. He looked up. The drawing-room windows were ablaze with light, yet Becky had written that she was in bed and ill. He let himself in. He could hear laughter in the upper rooms. Then he heard Lord Steyne's voice. Rawdon went up to the drawing-room. Lord Steyne was leaning over the sofa in which Becky sat. She was well dressed and wearing her diamonds. He had her hand in his and was kissing it. Becky started up with a faint scream when she caught sight of Rawdon's white face. She tried to smile as if to welcome her husband, and Lord Steyne rose up, grinding his teeth furious. He, too, attempted to laugh and came forward. "What, you've come back? How do you do, Crawley?" he said. I'm innocent, Becky pleaded with Lord Steyne. The latter thought a trap had been laid for him and was as furious with the wife as he was with the husband. "You innocent! I have given you £1,000, which this fellow has spent and for which he has sold you. You're as innocent as your husband. Don't think to frighten me as you have others. Make way, sir, and let me pass." Lord Steyne marched towards Rawdon, who called out, "You liar, you coward and villain," and struck the peer twice over the back. It was over before Rebecca could interpose. She stood there before her husband, trembling. At that moment she admired him, strong, brave, and victorious. Rawdon called her to him and told her to take off her jewels. She did so. He threw a piece after the lord, striking him on the face. "Come upstairs," he demanded of his wife. "Don't kill me, Rawdon," she pleaded. He laughed savagely. "I want to see if that man was lying about the money. Has he given you any?" "No," replied Rebecca. "That is—" "Give me your keys," Rawdon instructed. Rebecca gave him all but one of the keys. Rawdon opened everything except the desk, which Becky was forced to open. It contained both old and recent letters and notes, together with the £1,000 which Lord Steyne had given her. "Did he give you this?" demanded Rawdon, holding up the grey bill. "Yes." "I'll send it back to him," Rawdon said, "and I will pay off Briggs and some of the debts with the other money here. Let me know where I can send the rest to you if he refuses to accept it. You might have spared me £100, Becky, out of all this. I've always shared everything I have with you." "I am innocent," replied Becky. He left her without another word. She knew he would never come back. He was gone forever. She thought of her past life and of all the dismal incidents in it. Ah, how dreary it seemed, how miserable, lonely, and profitless, she reflected. Rawdon made his way to Sir Pitt Crawley's house in Great Gaunt Street. At 9, his brother arrived and asked what he was doing there. He told him it was all over with Becky. He continued, "It's not the money I want, it's the boy. I want you to promise me that you'll take charge of him when I'm gone. That dear wife of yours has always been good to him, and he's fonder of her than he is of his—" "Good God, is she dead?" Sir Pitt asked, alarmed. "I wish he was," Rawdon replied sadly. Sir Pitt instantly guessed the truth and surmised that Lord Steyne was the person whose life Rawdon wished to take. The Colonel told his older brother about the affair, who was much affected, and shook Rawdon's hand with a rare cordiality. Rawdon then took out some money from Becky's pocket-book and gave it to his brother to pay off Miss Briggs. In his nervousness, Rawdon dropped the book, and out fell the £1,000 note from Lord Steyne. Pitt stooped and picked it up. "I won't give Becky that," said Rawdon. "I hope to put a bullet into the man to whom that belongs." He thought to himself, it would be a fine thing to wrap a ball in this note and kill Steyne with it. Later that morning, Rawdon met an army acquaintance, McMurdo, saying he needed a friend. Rawdon explained his position. "Okay, old boy," said the old campaigner, "great man or not, we'll put a bullet in him, damn him." "You don't know how fond I was of that woman," Rawdon said. "I followed her round like a footman. I gave up everything I had to be with her. She may, after all, be innocent, she says so, but Steyne gave her this money in my own house." The captain would only admit that there was something odd about such an arrangement. That same day Rawdon heard that his creditors had arrived at his house and removed most of the valuable property. He was glad the boy was not at home to see it. "He's a regular trump, that boy," the father stated. "I say, Mac, if anything goes wrong, if I drop, I should like you to go and see him and say I was very fond of him. Give him these gold buttons. It's all I've got." Rawdon covered his face with his hands, over which tears rolled. Becky did not recover from the state of stupor and confusion into which the events of the previous night had plunged her intrepid spirits until the following afternoon, when she rang the bell for her maid. There was no response. Hearing a buzz and a stir below, and indignant at the impudence of servants who would not answer her summons, Mrs. Crawley flung her robe round her and descended to the drawing-room. She found the servants in a state of inebriation. At her appearance they proceeded to call at her, demanding their wages and telling her the Colonel would not be coming back. "You all seem to be against me," said Becky bitterly. "What do you want? I can't pay you everything. I thought Colonel Crawley had settled things with you. He will tomorrow, I'm sure. He has left me nothing. Let me go and find him." This statement caused the servants to look at one another with considerable surprise. Rebecca left them. Good heavens, she thought, was there ever such ill luck as mine? To be so near and then to lose everything. Is it too late? There was one more chance. She made her way to Sir Pitt Crawley's and was in his study before the astonished baronet had even laid down the paper. He turned red and started back with a look of great alarm and horror. "Do not look like that," she said. "I am not guilty, Pitt. Dear Pitt, everything is against me, and at the moment when all my hopes were about to be realized." "Is it true, then, what I see in the papers?" "It is true. Lord Steyne told me about it on the night of that fateful ball. Rawdon had been promised an appointment. Then that unfortunate arrest took place and that horrible meeting. I was only guilty of paying too much attention to Rawdon's fortune. I admit I have received Lord Steyne a loan 100 times before. I confess I had money of which Rawdon knew nothing." And so she went on with her story, which she poured into the ears of her perplexed kinsman. She said it was her aim to rescue her poor husband. She continued, "It was only on Friday morning that the news arrived of Lord Steyne's appointment of my dear husband as governor of Coventry Island. It was intended as a surprise for him. He was to see it in the papers today. Even after my dear husband's arrest, Lord Steyne was laughing with me, saying that my dearest Rawdon would be consoled when he read of the appointment in the paper while at the bailiff's house. And then he came home. His suspicions were excited, and a dreadful scene took place between Lord Steyne and Rawdon. And, oh, my God, what will happen next? Pitt, dear Pitt, pity me and reconcile us. She fell at the baronet's knees. It was after breakfast that Macmurdo and Rawdon went to their club. The habitués had not yet arrived at their posts, and so the newspaper room was almost empty. One of the men there, reading a Sunday paper, looked up as Rawdon came in and said, "Crawley, I congratulate you. It's in the Observer and the Royalist, too." "What?" cried Rawdon, turning red, thinking that his affair with Lord Steyne was already in print. He took the paper and read the astonishing paragraph which announced the offer to him of the governorship of Coventry Island. While Macmurdo and Crawley wondered at the posting, Mr. Wenham, as emissary from Lord Steyne, found them. He asked to speak with Crawley alone, saying, "I hope our conversation will lead to only the most agreeable results, very different from those you were expecting." "Humph," said Captain Macmurdo. "Hang these civilians," he thought. "They're always for arranging and speechifying." Mr. Wenham then sat down and took a paper from his pocket and resumed. "You've seen this gratifying announcement in the papers this morning, Colonel? The government will have secured a most valuable servant if you accept the offer, which I presume you do. You will find it a most excellent appointment. 3,000 a year, delightful climate, excellent government house, and almost certain promotion. I congratulate you with all my heart. I wish to let you know that you owe this appointment to Lord Steyne. You may be annoyed that I declare that I think your suspicions concerning his lordship are monstrous and utterly unfounded, and that they do great injustice to an honourable gentleman who has proved his goodwill towards you by 1,000 benefactions, in the same way you do great injustice to a blameless and innocent lady." "You don't mean to say that Crawley's mistaken?" asked Macmurdo. "I believe that Mrs. Crawley is as innocent as my own wife," Wenham replied with great energy. He continued, "Colonel Crawley, it was not only the body of my noble and excellent friend that was wounded. His heart, sir, also suffered. A man whom he has loaded with benefits and regarded with affection had subjected him to the foulest indignity. His first order to me was to write a letter of challenge and to bring it to you. One or other of us, he said, must not survive last night's outrage. I spent an hour discussing the matter with his lordship. I implored him not to send the challenge." "I don't believe a word of it," replied Rawdon. "I believe it's a damned lie, and that you're in on it, Wenham. If the challenge doesn't come from him, then, by Jove, it will come from me." Mr. Wenham turned deadly pale at this savage interruption. However, he found unexpected support from Captain Macmurdo, who rose with an oath and rebuked Rawdon for his language. He further declared that he would not carry the challenge to Lord Steyne, and that it was his belief that Rawdon's accusation against Mrs. Crawley was not proved. "Captain Macmurdo, you speak like a man of sense," replied Mr. Wenham. "This matter, I believe, ought to be buried in the most profound oblivion. Not a word concerning it should ever pass these doors." "I suppose Lord Steyne won't talk about it," commented Macmurdo, "and I don't see why our side should. If you are satisfied, I think we should agree." Mr. Wenham, on hearing this, took his hat and, accompanied by the captain, left the room, leaving Rawdon alone. "It was all a mistake, my dear sir," Lord Steyne's agent said as he departed. On their way out they met Sir Pitt Crawley and told him the matter was settled. Sir Pitt was pleased with the news and went into Rawdon to congratulate him. He then tried to effect a reconciliation between his brother and Mrs. Crawley, but Rawdon would not hear of it. His head sank, and he looked quite broken and sad. "Poor old boy," commented Macmurdo, shaking his head. Rawdon agreed to accept the colonial posting, and the secret of his dispute with Lord Steyne was thereby buried in the profoundest oblivion, both by the principals and by their seconds. The late tenant of Curzon Street had gone, no one knew where. Rawdon made her a tolerable annuity, and we may be sure she was a woman who could make a little money go a great way. He also remitted a sum to his brother regularly and wrote to his little boy at every mail. Little Rawdon used to like to get the papers and read about His Excellency. His mother never made any attempt to see the child, who went home to his aunt for Sundays and holidays, and was frequently at Queen's Crawley. George Osborne was now established in his grandfather's mansion in Russell Square, heir apparent to all the splendours there. His good looks, gallant bearing, and gentlemanlike appearance won his grandfather's heart. Mr. Osborne was as proud of him as ever he had been of the elder George. Old Osborne's business continued to prosper, and his wealth and position in the city greatly increased. The old man considered that the young George had even better prospects than his father would have had. He saw him in his mind's eye as a collegian, a parliament man, a baronet even. Old Osborne would die contented if he could see his grandson so honoured. Amelia now busied herself in gentle offices and quiet duties. If she never said brilliant things, she never thought or spoke unkind ones. Guileless and artless, loving and pure, she was a real gentlewoman. While his mother was yearning after young George at home, the young gentleman himself enjoyed a number of pleasures and consolations which enabled him to bear the separation from Amelia very easily. Master George had every comfort and luxury that a wealthy and lavish old grandfather thought fit to provide. Meanwhile, young George's maternal grandfather was full of respect for the little tyrant. He could not help admiring the lad who had such fine clothes and rode with a groom behind him. Georgie, on his part, was constantly hearing abuse and satire levelled at John Sedley by his pitiless old enemy, Mr. Osborne. How was the young lad to respect a man so prostrate? A few months after George moved in with his paternal grandfather, Mrs. Sedley died. There had been little love between her and the child, and George did not care to show much grief. After her mother's death, all Amelia's time and tenderness were devoted to the consolation and comfort of her bereaved old father, who was stunned by the new blow which had befallen him. His wife, his honour, his fortune, everything he loved best, had disappeared, and now there was only Amelia to stand by and support him with her gentle arms around the tottering, heartbroken old man. After her mother's death, Amelia determined that she would try to make her old father happy. Old Sedley grew very fond of his daughter, and Amelia found consolation in doing her duty by the old man. Major Dobbin, on his return journey from Madras, had Joss as a fellow passenger on board ship. Having served his full time in India, Joss, together with a considerable sum of money, was free to come home and stay on a good pension. He was now rather thinner than when we last heard of him, but had gained in majesty and solemnity of demeanour. Many a night, as the ship was coursing through the roaring dark sea, Mr. Sedley and the Major would sit on the quarter-deck talking about home. During these conversations, it was wonderful with what perseverance and ingenuity Major Dobbin would manage to bring the talk round to the subject of Amelia and her little boy. He made Joss promise to take charge of Amelia and her unprotected child. As yet, he did not know what events had happened in the Sedley family during his absence. Every day this smitten, middle-aged gentleman thought about Mrs. Osborne, and his whole heart was bent on doing her good. On his arrival in London, the Major made his way in the direction of Brompton. Every minute incident of his last meeting with Amelia was in his mind as he walked towards her house. When he reached her gate, he said to himself, "May God Almighty bless her, whatever has happened." The landlord and landlady of the house led the worthy Major into Sedley's room and told him of the recent events in the family. Twice or three times Dobbin was going to ask about the marriage question, but his heart failed him. Finally, he was informed that Mrs. Osborne had gone for a walk in Kensington Gardens with her father. He was led to them by Polly, the landlord's daughter. On the way, they encountered the Reverend Binny, and Miss Polly told the Major that he had recently married Miss Grits. The Major started, standing for a moment silent and open-mouthed as he looked after the retreating young couple. Presently they went on and caught sight of Mr. Sedley and Amelia. Amelia saw Dobbin, blushed, and began to cry. He looked at her as she came running towards him, her hands outstretched. She hadn't changed. A little paler, perhaps, a little stouter in figure. She gave him both her hands as she looked up, flushing and smiling through her tears, into Dobbin's honest, homely face. He was speechless for a moment. I've another arrival to announce, he said after a pause. Mrs. Dobbin? Amelia asked, making a move backwards. No, he replied firmly, there is no Mrs. Dobbin. Your brother Joss travelled back with me in the same ship and has returned home to make you all happy. Papa, Papa, Amelia cried out, Joss is returned to England. He has come to take care of you, and here is Major Dobbin. Mr. Sedley stepped forward and made an old-fashioned bow to the Major and asked whether his worthy father, Sir William, was well. The Major accepted old Sedley's invitation to tea. Amelia was very happy, smiling and active all that evening, performing her duties as hostess with the utmost grace and propriety. While her father was awake, she did not talk much about George. But as Mr. Sedley began to doze, Amelia started her conversation eagerly. It concerned George exclusively. She did not talk at all about her own sufferings at breaking from him, but rather about everything concerning him, his virtues, talents, and prospects. She poured them all out. The delighted mother said, "Oh, William, what a treasure heaven has given me in that boy. He is the comfort of my life, and he is the image of his father." Presently William took his leave, and so the first day was over, and he had seen her. The Major's visit left old John Sedley in a great state of agitation and excitement. When Joss eventually arrived at the house in Brompton, Amelia, in a great flutter, was in the passage among the hats and coats, and old John Sedley in the parlour, shaking all over. The two were much affected by their reunion with Joss. In turn, Joss was unaffectedly glad to see and shake the hand of his father, between whom and himself there had been such a coolness. Glad also to see his little sister. Later, as Joss drove away to his hotel, Amelia embraced her father tenderly, appealing to him with an air of triumph and asking the old man whether she had not always said that her brother had a good heart. Indeed, Joseph Sedley, affected by the humble position in which he found his relations, declared that they should never suffer want or discomfort any more, that since he was to be home for some time, his house and everything he had should be theirs, and that Amelia would look very pretty at the head of his table, at least until she could accept one of her own. At first she declined his offer, yet Joss remained determined. Amelia was made aware of the honest Major's reaction to the news that she was not to be married, and of his passion for her. She did not rebuff him in any way or feel displeased with him, but neither would Amelia encourage her admirer. She would continue to give him that friendly look which so much excellence and fidelity merited. She would treat him with perfect cordiality and frankness until he made his proposals. Only then would it be the time for her to speak up and put an end to his hopes, which could never be realized. Joss was pressed by the Major to carry out his promise to provide a home for Amelia and his father. It became a matter of great delight to Joss to superintend the building of a handsome carriage which he and the Major had ordered. When complete, Joss drove about in state in the park or called on his Indian friends. Old Sedley and Amelia took advantage of it, and one day Joss's carriage called for them at Brompton, never to return. Major Dobbin was exceedingly pleased when, as he was superintending the arrangements for Joss's new house, the removal cart from Brompton arrived, bringing the emigrants' trunks and hand-boxes, and with them the old piano. Amelia had put it in her sitting-room on the second floor, which adjoined her father's room, where the old gentleman would often sit in the evenings. Amelia commented, "I value that piece more than anything else in the world." "Do you really, Amelia?" asked the Major. "Can I do otherwise, since George gave it to me?" "I did not know," said Major Dobbin, his face falling. Amelia did not immediately understand his dismal expression. It only struck her afterwards, with inexpressible pain and mortification, that it was William who had given her the piano, after all, and not George, as she had imagined. It had been her dearest reminder of George, and now she realized that she had been wrong for so long. It was valueless now. The next time old Sedley asked her to play the piano, she said it was out of tune. The next, that she had a headache and that she couldn't play. Then she rebuked herself for her petty attitude and decided to make it up to William. A few days later, as they were seated together in the drawing-room, she said to him, "I have to ask your pardon about the little piano. I never thanked you for it when you gave it to me many, many years ago, before I was married. I thought somebody else had given it to me." "Thank you, William." She held out her hand. William could no longer restrain his feelings. "Amelia, Amelia, I did buy it for you. I loved you then as I do now. I must tell you, I think I loved you from the first moment I saw you. Since then I have thought of only one woman in the world, you. I came to tell you this before I went out to India, but then you did not care whether I stayed or not." "I was very ungrateful." "No, only indifferent. I understand your feelings about the piano now that you remember it came from me and not from George. It is I who should apologize for believing that my years of devotion might influence you." "It is you who are being cruel now," responded Amelia. "How could I love anyone but George? I am his. Yet have you not been everything to me and my boy? Our dearest, truest, kindest friend and protector? Had you arrived sooner, I would have perhaps been spared that dreadful parting. At the time they came to take him away from me, I wished and prayed for your arrival. Isn't George a noble boy, William? Please continue to be his friend and mine." Here her voice broke, and she hid her face on his shoulder. The Major took her in his arms and kissed her head. "I will not change, dear Amelia," he said. "I ask for no more than your love. I would not have it otherwise. Let me stay near you and see you often." "Yes, often," Amelia replied. And so William was now at liberty to look longingly at her. Good fortune now began to smile upon Amelia. Numbers of people now came to see Mrs. Osborne. Lady Dobbin and her daughters were delighted at her change of fortune, and even visitors from Russell Square came. Jos was reported to be tremendously rich, and old Osborne let it be known he had no objection to Georgie inheriting his uncle's property as well as his own. "Damn it, we will make a great man of the fellow," he said, "and I'll see him in Parliament before I die. You may go and see his mother, Miss O, though I'll never set eyes on her." Miss Osborne went to Amelia. Amelia was very glad to see her, and thereby be brought nearer to George. That young fellow was now allowed to see his mother much more frequently than before. He dined once or twice in Gillespie Street and bullied the servants and his relations there, just as he did in Russell Square. However, he was always respectful to Major Dobbin, since he was afraid of him. George could not help admiring his friend's simplicity, his good humour, his learning, and his general love of truth and justice. He had met no such man so far in the course of his experience, and he had an instinctive liking for the gentleman. He hung fondly by his godfather's side, and delighted in Dobbin's talk about his father, India, and Waterloo, everything, in fact, except about himself. Georgie never tired of praising the Major to his mother. It must be confessed that no great love existed between the boy and his uncle. The worthy Jos was haunted by a dim consciousness that the lad thought him crass and was ridiculing him. There came a day when the round of decorous pleasures and solemn gaieties in which Jos Sedley's family indulged was interrupted by an event which happens in most houses. The period of mourning for Mrs. Sedley's death was only just concluded, when it became evident that the old man was about to follow his wife. He clung to his daughter during his final sickness, loving her with more fondness now than ever he had done since the days of her childhood. In the discharge of gentle offices and filial duties, Amelia shone particularly well. She walks into the room as silently as a sunbeam, Major Dobbin thought as her cheerful, sweet presence passed to and fro, peaceful and quiet. In this way a secret feud of many years' standing was healed with a tacit reconciliation. The old man forgave Amelia and forgot the grief she may have brought her parents in respect of her marriage and her boy. One night she found him awake, and the broken man made his confession. "Oh, Amelia, I've been thinking we were very unjust and unkind to you," he said, and put out his cold and feeble hand to her. She knelt down and prayed by his bedside. And so there came one morning when all the world got up and set about its various works and pleasures, with the exception of old man Sedley, who was not to fight, hope, or scheme again, but instead was to go and take up a quiet residence beside his wife in Brompton churchyard. Major Dobbin, Joss, and Georgie followed his remains to the grave. Joss decided not to remain in the house under the circumstances, but Amelia stayed and did her duty as usual. She was bowed down by no special grief and was rather more solemn than sorrowful. She hoped that her own end would be as calm and as painless. "You see," said old Osborne to George, "what comes of merit and industry and speculations. Look at me and my bank account, then look at your poor grandfather Sedley and his failure. And yet he was a better man than I 20 years ago, a better man, I would say, by 10,000 pounds. Beyond these people there was not another soul alive who cared a penny piece about old John Sedley, or still remembered him. The Major's growing reputation and his standing as guardian to Georgie, a position ceded to his grandfather, made meetings between old Osborne and Major Dobbin inevitable. It was during one of these that old Osborne, a keen businessman, learned that a part of the fund on which the widow and the child had subsisted had been provided by William. When pressed about the matter, William finally confessed, at which the old man shook his hand in thanks. Often he tried to soften the old man's attitude towards his son's memory by telling the old father as many stories as he could remember of the gallantry and achievements of his son. "And Georgie is so like him," the Major added. "He's so like him it makes me tremble sometimes," the grandfather replied. However, within days, the old man's mood was more charitable towards his son, and he recommended Miss Osborne to think highly of William Dobbin. That old Osborne's mind was changing was pretty clear, for he even told young George that there was no longer a quarrel between himself and Mr. Sedley. One evening, Joss and the Major were asked to dinner at Russell Square. More than once Osborne asked about Mrs. George Osborne. William told of her sufferings, saying, "You don't know what she endured, sir, and I hope and I trust you will be reconciled to her. If she took your son away from you, she gave hers to you, and however much you loved your George, depend on it, she loved hers 10 times more." "By God, you are a good fellow, sir," was all Mr. Osborne said. A reconciliation was coming up quickly and certainly, and Amelia's heart began to beat faster at the thought of a meeting with George's father. It was never, however, to take place. Mr. Sedley's illness and death had intervened. That catastrophe and perhaps other events may have worked on Mr. Osborne. He was much shaken, and his mind was turning inwards. He sent for his lawyers, and his doctor advised that he spend some time by the sea. One day at breakfast time, he was found in a fit in his dressing room. Miss Osborne was told, doctors were sent for, and Georgie kept home from school. Although the old man recovered consciousness, he was unable to speak again, and died 4 days later. It was evident that he had been looking at his papers when he had his seizure, for in his dressing-gown pocket was found the letter that George had written from Waterloo. When the will was opened, it was found that half Osborne's property was left to George, and the remainder equally between the 2 sisters. An annuity of £500, chargeable on George's property, was left to his mother, the widow of my beloved son George Osborne, who was to resume guardianship of the boy. Major William Dobbin, my beloved son's friend, was appointed executor as a result of his kindness and bounty in maintaining my grandson and my son's widow with his own private funds when they were otherwise without means of support, the testator went on to say. I hereby thank him heartily for his love and regard for them, and leave him such a sum as may be sufficient to purchase his commission as a lieutenant colonel, or which may be disposed of in any way he may think fit. When Amelia heard that her father-in-law was reconciled to her, her heart melted, and she was grateful for the fortune left to her. But when she heard how Georgie was restored to her, and that it was William's bounty that supported her in poverty, she sank to her knees, praying for blessings on his constant and kind heart. Gratitude was all she had to pay back such admirable devotion. If she thought of any other means, George's image stood up out of his grave and said, "You are mine, and mine only, now and forever." William knew her feelings. Had he not spent his whole life in divining them? Mrs. Osborne and her son took up residence in Richmond, where the smiling lawyers came over to see her, and where, of course, there was room for the Major, too, who rode over frequently, having much business to transact on behalf of his little ward, who was now on an unlimited holiday from Mr. Veal's school. Before the period of grief for Mr. Osborne had subsided, Emmy found herself in the centre of a very genteel circle indeed, now that her fortune was restored. But this sort of society was really too much for her, and everyone jumped for joy when a continental tour was proposed. A few weeks later, one fine morning, they departed for the continent. Excepting Joss, the whole party engaged in the regular afternoon excursions when Dobbin acted as the guide and interpreter. They went to the opera often. A new world of love and beauty was introduced to Amelia when she first heard the divine compositions of Mozart. The Major and Amelia were very contented and enjoyed as pleasant a summer tour as any pair that left England that year. Although Georgie was always present, it was the Major who assisted Amelia on the walks and excursions, while the young lad went ahead. The small party eventually reached Pumpernickel, which Joss Sedley was soon praising as a most pleasant little place he had yet visited on the tour. Joss was convinced that the place offered everything to him, the springs, which would improve his health, the doctor, the court, and the chargé d'affaires. He decided to spend the autumn in this delightful town. At the time of the annual festival, roulette was allowed in the town hall. Although the officers and townspeople were not permitted to play, strangers, peasants, and ladies were admitted, and any visitor who chose could win or lose money there. George Osborne, whose pockets were always full of money, and whose relatives were away at a grand festival at court, arrived at the Stadthaus accompanied by his uncle's courier, Mr. Kirsch. Though not permitted to play on account of his age, he loitered eagerly about the tables where the croupiers and punters were at work. A few ladies were playing, some of whom wore masks. A woman, with light hair and in a low-cut dress which looked old-fashioned, and a black mask, was seated at one of the tables with a card, a pin, and a couple of florins before her. She only seemed to venture her money after red and black had come up a number of times. It was strange to watch her. In spite of her care, she guessed wrong, and the last 2 florins followed each other under the croupier's rake. She gave a sigh, and dashing the pin through the card, sat thumbing it for a while. Then she glanced up and noticed Georgie's honest face staring at her. The little scamp! What business had he to be there? She stared at the boy with her striking eyes, and then called him over. "Play this for me, if you please. Put it on any number." And she took a purse from her bosom and then removed the only coin there, a gold piece. The boy laughed and did as he was bid, having checked that Mr. Kirsch was not watching. The number came up, sure enough. "Thank you," she said, pulling the money towards her. "Thank you. What is your name?" "My name's Osborne," said Georgie, fingering the coins in his own pocket in anticipation of a play. Just then the Major and Joss arrived from the court ball. The former quickly pulled the boy away from this place of temptation, and seeing Kirsch at one of the other tables, asked why he had dared to bring George to such a place. Kirsch seemed under the influence of both the play and the wine he was drinking, so the Major did not argue further. He returned to Joss, who was standing next to the lady in the mask, very much interested in her game. "Hadn't you better come, Joss?" the Major said, "with George and me." "I think I'll stay a while and go home with that rascal Kirsch," Joss replied. Dobbin did not care to remonstrate with Joss, but left him and walked home with Georgie. On the way, the Major made Georgie promise never to gamble. The boy promised. Meanwhile, Joss remained at the gaming table, sitting beside the lady in the mask. Presently she remarked, "You do not play to win, neither do I. I play to forget, but I cannot. I cannot forget old times, monsieur. Your little nephew is the image of his father, and you have not changed. But I suppose you have, for everybody changes, everybody forgets. Nobody has a heart any longer." "Good God, who are you?" Joss asked, flustered. "Can't you guess, Joseph Sedley?" said the little woman in a sad voice. Undoing her mask, she looked at him. "You have forgotten me." "Good heavens! Mrs. Crawley," gasped Joss. "Rebecca," replied the lady, turning back to her game. She told him where she was staying, adding, "I saw my dear Amelia today. How pretty she looks, and how happy. So do you. Everybody is but me. I am wretched, Joseph Sedley." She moved her money over from the red to the black, as if by a chance movement. The red came up again, and she had lost the whole of that stake. "Come with me, Mr. Sedley, for we are old friends, are we not?" For 2 years after the Curzon Street catastrophe, Becky was seized not by remorse, but by a kind of despair. She absolutely neglected her person and did not even care for her reputation. This abasement did not happen all at once, but rather by degrees. Her appeal to Sir Pitt Crawley did not succeed. Probably Lady Jane interposed. She was determined to disown Mrs. Crawley, but so was Sir Pitt, who discovered her entire history from Mr. Wenham. As for Rawdon, he could not spare her more than £300 a year, which he proposed to pay her on condition that she would never trouble him again. It seemed in everybody's interest at that time to get Becky out of the country and hush up a most disagreeable affair. She was probably so preoccupied in sorting out these matters that she forgot to do anything whatever about her son, and did not even go and see him. As a result, the young gentleman was consigned to the guardianship of his aunt and uncle. His mother eventually wrote him a neat little letter from Boulogne in which she requested him to concentrate on his studies. She explained she was going on a continental tour, during which she would write to him again. She did not do so for over a year, and only then when she heard Sir Pitt's only boy had died. Then Becky wrote the most affectionate composition to her darling son, who had been made heir to Queen's Crawley by this accident. On its receipt, young Rawdon declared, "Oh, Aunt Jane, you are my real mother, and not that one." He wrote back a kind and respectful but unencouraging letter to her. By then she was living in Florence. Becky felt she was quite alone, and knew the far-off cliffs of England were now impassable to her. She gained a reputation as being unfit for the better hotels, and was asked to leave the more illustrious establishments by the landlords. Yet she continued to do everything that was respectable. She noticed people avoiding her, and still laboriously smiled upon them. You could never have supposed from her countenance what pangs of humiliation she might be enduring inwardly. Yet whenever Becky made a little circle for herself with incredible labor, somebody came and rudely swept it away. She had to begin all her work again. It was very hard, lonely, and disheartening. Becky fled uneasily from one colony to another, trying with all her might to be respectable, and, alas, always found out some day or other, and thrown out. So our little wanderer went about, setting up her tent in the various cities of Europe. Her taste for unrespectability grew more and more. She became a perfect bohemian before long, gathering with people it would make your hair stand on end to meet. She became no better than a vagabond. When she received her allowance from Rawdon, she gambled. When she gambled it away, she went to any lengths to live. Who knows how or by what means she succeeded. In Florence, she met Lord Steyne again. The scar cut by the diamond her husband had thrown at him was still visible on his whiskered face. Immediately she saw him, Becky resumed her fine airs and tried to look and feel as if she were in Mayfair once again. On seeing her, his lordship stared aghast at her for a minute until Becky was called away by her companion. The following day, Becky received a note that stated that Italy could be very unwholesome. This threat had its desired effect, and she no longer tried to intrude on her old patron, whose possible assistance to her disappeared forever in 1830, when he died after a series of fits. That day, after their meeting at the gaming table, Joss went out alone early in the morning to see Becky. In Becky's Spartan room they had a long, amicable and confidential talk, in the course of which Joss Sedley was somehow made aware that Becky's heart had first learned to beat faster during his presence. That George Osborne had certainly paid an unjustifiable attention to her, which might account for Amelia's jealousy and their little differences, but Becky protested she was entirely innocent. She claimed she had never ceased to think about Joss from the very first day she had seen him, though of course her duties as a married woman were paramount. She had always observed these duties and would do so until her dying day or that of her husband. Joss went away convinced that she was the most virtuous and fascinating of women, and thinking up all sorts of benevolent schemes for her welfare. Her persecutions ought to be ended. He would see what could be done. Amelia must come and see her and befriend her again. He would settle the matter and consult the Major. Becky wept tears of heartfelt gratitude as she parted from Joss. As soon as he had gone, 2 of her German friends emerged from their hiding places in the room. Becky entertained them with an impersonation of Joss, as she munched cold sausage and bread with them. Joss walked over to Dobbin's lodgings with great solemnity and recounted to the Major of the story which he had just heard. Amelia was a woman of such soft and foolish disposition that when she heard of anybody unhappy, her heart melted straight away. When the Major heard the sentimental adventure which had befallen Joss, he was not as interested in it as the man from Bengal had been. On the contrary, he said, "The little minx, has she come to light again?" William Dobbin had never had the slightest liking for Becky, and completely distrusted her from the very first moment her green eyes had met and turned away from his own. "The little devil brings mischief wherever she goes," he thought. Yet he agreed that they should consult Amelia. He believed a jealous woman never forgives, and so Joss and he went across to see Mrs. Osborne. Joss told Amelia of his most extraordinary adventure. "Don't let me see her," Amelia stated. "I couldn't see her." "Told you so," Dobbin said to Joss. "She is very unhappy and that sort of thing," urged Joss. "She is very poor and unprotected, and has been very ill. That scoundrel of a husband of hers has deserted her." "Ah," said Amelia. "She hasn't a friend in the world," Joss went on. "She's so miserable, Amelia. Her story quite affected me. Her family have been most cruel to her. She has the most beautiful child ever seen, a perfect angel who adored his mother. The ruffians tore him shrieking out of her arms and have never allowed him to see her since." "Dear Joseph," cried Amelia, "let us go and see her this minute." She then asked Dobbin to go with them. The Major saw that there was nothing for it but to obey. By the time they arrived, Becky had cleared her German friends from her room and removed all traces of her visitors. Amelia sprang with open arms towards Rebecca and forgave her instantly. Amelia then asked about her poor child. Becky responded with a story of her agonies. The 2 women continued talking for an hour or more, allowing Becky to relate a new version of her history. This portrayed her husband as the protagonist in the affair with Lord Steyne. Becky said she was forced to flee insulted, and that her cowardly husband had pursued his revenge by taking away her child, leaving her a poor, unprotected, friendless, and wretched wanderer. Amelia quivered with indignation at this account of Rawdon's miserable conduct and Staines' indiscipline. Meanwhile, the Major took a table downstairs. He was convinced that Mrs. Crawley was up to her old tricks. He was reflecting on the position when Amelia tapped him on the shoulder. At that time she had a way of behaving like a tyrant over Major Dobbin, whom she treated as her lapdog. She was in high spirits and good humour, and tripped across the market-place briskly to see Jos. "Well?" Jos asked. "The poor creature, how she has suffered," Amelia said. "God bless my soul, yes," replied Jos. "She may have my maid's room," said Amelia. "You don't mean to say that you are going to have that woman in the house," exclaimed the Major. "Of course we are. Don't be angry, Major Dobbin. Of course we are going to have her here, poor dear thing." "Don't have her in the house, I implore you," cried the Major. "You are always so good and kind, or always used to be at any rate. I'm astonished at you, Major William," Amelia said. "Now is the time to be of service to her. She is the oldest friend I ever had, and not—" "She was not always your friend, Amelia," shouted Dobbin angrily. "Why, Major, to allude to that! It was cruel to remind me." She paced the room, trembling. Poor Dobbin! His short outburst had undone the work of many years, in which lay buried passions and unknown sacrifices. William, though he saw by Amelia's looks that a great crisis had come, continued to implore her to beware of Rebecca. His entreaties were halted by the arrival of Becky herself. She greeted Amelia with the greatest warmth, but took no notice of the Major, except to fling him an angry look. Dobbin bowed and departed. In a state of rage, William walked about the town until he met an old acquaintance, Lord Tapeworm, who invited him to dinner. Tapeworm, on being asked by his guest whether he knew anything of Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, poured into the astonished Major's ears the true story of Rebecca and her husband. The Major went to see Amelia the following day. In Becky's presence, he announced, "I have come to say that I think Mrs. Crawley is not a fit companion for you, Mrs. Osborne, or your son. I know all about your conduct, Mrs. Crawley. I do not wish to go into details in front of Mrs. Osborne." "Rebecca," broke in Amelia, "stay with me. I, for one, won't dislike you simply because everyone else persecutes or insults you, just as Major Dobbin does. I am merely acting in respect of the responsibility left me by George's father," William said firmly. "Yes, and you insulted his memory yesterday, and I will never forgive you, never," responded Amelia angrily. "Amelia, I have loved you and watched you for 15 years in vain. I know what your heart is capable of. I now know you are not worthy of the love I have devoted to you. I knew all along that the prize I had set my life on was not worth winning. I was a fool. I will bargain with you no more. Instead, I withdraw. I can find no fault with you. You just couldn't reach up to the height of the attachment which I bore you, and which a loftier soul than yours might have been proud to share. Goodbye, Amelia. Let our struggle end. We are both weary of it." Amelia was petrified at this sudden break in the chain of her life. She didn't wish to marry William, but she did wish to keep him by her. "Am I to understand, then, that you are going away, William?" she asked, pathetically. He gave a sad laugh. "I went away once before, but returned after 12 years. This is the final goodbye. I've spent enough of my life at play." The parting over, William walked to the door. That evening the Major left, hearing Georgie crying after him as he did so. Amelia was not happy following her heroic sacrifice. Not caring for society and moving from place to place a great deal, Amelia's chief pleasure in the summer evenings was to take long walks with Georgie. Then mother and son would talk about the Major in a way that made the boy smile. She told him she thought Major William the best man in the world. Meanwhile, Becky changed her habits with her new situation in life, wearing fashionable clothes and giving up gambling. One day she told Amelia she should return to England and marry, saying, "You must marry, or you and your precious boy will go to ruin. You must have a husband, and yet you have rejected one of the best gentlemen I ever saw. You are a silly, heartless, ungrateful little creature." "I tried my best, Rebecca, but I couldn't forget—" She looked up at George's portrait. "Couldn't forget him? That selfish dandy. Why, the man was tired of you. Only Dobbin forced him to keep his word. He never really cared for you." Becky then gave Amelia the paper George had given her on the night of the Duchess of Richmond's ball. It was as she said. The young man had asked her to go away with him. Amelia gave way to her emotions. Becky treated her like a child and asked her friend to write to Dobbin. 2 days later, William came over by boat and met Amelia at Ostend in the pouring rain. She folded herself into his cloak and kissed him. "It was time you sent for me, my dear Amelia," he said. "You will never go away again, will you, William?" "No, never," he answered. Georgie came up to them and danced round the couple. This is what William had prayed for every day for the last 18 years. And it is here that our story really ends. Rebecca never showed herself in front of Colonel Dobbin and his new bride again. Only Georgie and his uncle were present at the ceremony. When it was over, Becky returned to console Jos Sedley. Colonel Dobbin shortly thereafter rented a country place close to Queen's Crawley. Lady Jane and Mrs. Dobbin became great friends. Mrs. Rawdon Crawley's name was never again mentioned by either family. Wherever Jos Sedley went, she travelled with him, and that infatuated man seemed entirely her slave. Jos insured his life with Mrs. Crawley as a likely beneficiary. He was certain he could never leave her, even though Colonel Dobbin pleaded with him to return to England. 3 months after Dobbin's last visit, Joseph Sedley died at Aix-la-Chapelle. All he had left was to be equally divided between Amelia and Rebecca. The insurance company at first refused to pay the insurance, having suspicions about the case, until Rebecca arrived and finally triumphed. She never became Lady Crawley, though she liked to call herself so. Rawdon Crawley was to die of yellow fever only 6 weeks before the demise of his brother, Sir Pitt. The estate devolved on the young Rawdon Crawley, who, although he declined to see his mother, made her a liberal allowance. The self-styled Lady Crawley now resides chiefly in Bath and Cheltenham, where a certain number of excellent people consider her to be a most injured woman. Yet she still has her enemies.